Good afternoon, everyone. If you can take your seats, we will get started momentarily. And now I'd like to invite Rebecca Blumenstein up to begin our programming.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces and many new faces as well. I'm Rebecca Blumenstein. I'm president of editorial for NBC News, and I'm very happy to be here today to kick off an important and urgent discussion about global press freedom. I'm especially honored to introduce two leaders who play a unique role in setting the standard for the highest levels of journalism today, protecting our rights to practice it and educating the next generation of journalists. They come at it in different ways. Jelani Cobb, of course, Dean of Columbia's Journalism School, and A.G. Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times. But I would argue that you cannot find two people who more model the transparency, trust, and commitment required to help both journalists and journalism navigate through this difficult and challenging moment. And I've been honored to work with them both. I think we would all agree that we are at an inflection point in journalism. We're deeply troubled by the attacks on journalists for doing their jobs. Sadly, in 2024, at least 124 journalists were killed, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. That's a higher number than any other year since the organization began recording such data more than 3 decades ago. And while it used to be that we focus mostly on threats to journalists abroad, we are dealing with more threats to journalism closer to home here in the United States, whether it's challenges to the Sullivan Court precedent that is the bedrock to our current press freedoms, or challenges about who gets to ask questions of the Trump administration. But we can also acknowledge that there is a crisis of trust facing journalism, and the reality that we can do a better job of reflecting the realities of the people we cover, getting out into the country with that blank notebook and seeking to walk in people's footsteps to better understand their perspectives. AG has studied threats to global press freedom, and in a prescient essay in the Washington Post last December, detailed a playbook that leaders of Hungary, India, and Brazil have used to crack down on the press. Without the U.S. standing as a beacon of free press to the rest of the world, AG wrote, and President Trump's popularization of the term fake news during his first term and ongoing, around 70 countries in 6 continents have enacted quote-unquote fake news laws. AG urged journalists to be prepared in case the tables turn here in the U.S., noting that, quote, they must be ready to continue to bring the truth to the public without fear or favor. It's a mission that Adolph Ochs, who founded the New York Times in 1896, published in a Declaration of Principles that has guided the Times ever since. He happens to be AG's great-great-grandfather, and I would say that mission could not be more apt or inspiring today. From his perch as the Dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, Dean Cobb has played a leadership role in educating the next generation of journalists and inspiring us all, and somehow still having time to be a staff writer at The New Yorker as well. He's a remarkable journalist on top of it. Dean Cobb has been a leader in helping to make journalism education more affordable, more accessible. He's also developed creative solutions to the problem of local news and the business model of journalism, pioneering a loan repayment assistance program for recent graduates who take positions in nonprofit news. Columbia also plays a unique role to journalists around the world who may never have the privilege of setting foot on this campus. I know this from Li Yuan, now a prominent columnist for the New York Times, who writes about China and its leadership in an utterly singular and courageous way. She did this after her leaving a post as a top foreign correspondent for the Xinhua news agency years ago, after being stationed in Thailand, when she somehow realized one day that her stories were different than that of those who worked for Western media companies. She got to know an editor at the Wall Street Journal who sponsored her application to Columbia, and she was able to secure a scholarship to Columbia. and her story goes from there. It never would have been possible, her journey, without Columbia's journalism school. And this role for Columbia, even for those journalists who aren't fortunate enough to be here, is truly unique. It serves as a beacon of the highest level of journalism anywhere in the world, a role that is exemplified every year by the soon-to-be-announced Pulitzer Prizes. In the 2025 Reuters Memorial Lecture at Oxford University, Dean Cobb probed an essential question: how do we inspire the public to believe what we are reporting? And I'll quote him: "Journalism should steal a page from the social sciences, where every source is documented, and the hard sciences, where every finding must be replicable." At NBC, a news organization with a mission to make premium news accessible to millions, press freedom is also paramount to us. And I'm so glad we're here today to discuss strategies for how we move forward, for the sake of so many aspiring and practicing journalists who provide an essential check on our democracy and governments around the world for people around the world. So I'd like to call up Dean Cobb and A.G. Sulzberger. Thank you.
So, AG, it's good to see you.
Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for coming out. And thank you to all of you who took time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. I wish, when we first met, we were kind of joking about our mutually incredibly packed schedules and not having time to actually catch up for coffee. And I wish we were able to actually have that conversation now under much more amiable circumstances, but we're here to talk about
Yeah, and there's a lot of people watching too.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we wouldn't be able to share any of the good gossip.
Yeah, no, that'd be a little weird, right? So let's just jump right in. One of the things that struck me about, one, it's striking just to see the argument that you lay out, that we are now confronting questions and obstacles to the free press that we've seen in much more repressive areas, places that do not have the history of freedom of the press that the United States has. And this is actually a serious concern that we have to navigate now. It also was notable in that you published it in the pages of the Washington Post, which you describe as an esteemed competitor. And I wonder, one, why you wrote the piece, and two, why you decided to publish it in the pages of the Washington Post.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, and thank you, Rebecca, for that generous introduction. We miss you at the Times, but we're cheering you on at NBC. So why I wrote the piece? I think it's worth taking a step back. When I was named publisher, as the next publisher at the Times, it was pretty clear I was going to spend my entire career on basically two challenges. There's sort of one challenge at the end of the days, but it's basically two, which was transitioning or evolving a 174-year-old tradition-bound newspaper into the digital era, and then figuring out a way to make enough money doing that in the digital era to pay for it all, right? And that was the existential threat that faced the American press in that moment. Something like 2 weeks after I was named to the job, we had already dressed the Madam President front page. Donald Trump surprises America, surprises himself by winning the presidency. And, whether you think he's a symptom, a cause, or a bit of both, he basically announces an entirely new challenge for the industry, which is the most direct attack on the legitimacy, the rights, and the safety of journalists that we've seen in many generations. Probably, in the first term, I was often saying probably since Wilson, right, in World War I. It was even interesting to watch the evolution in that term, right? So, you can take the Times as an example. He starts the term calling us the failing New York Times, which is sort of a schoolyard insult, doesn't really mean much, right? That evolves to the fake news New York Times, right? So it gets more centrally at legitimacy, right? At what we do, and then evolves eventually to the enemy of the people, New York Times, right? And which is a pretty big step because, as I would remind people who dismissed it just as rhetoric, what is a president expected to do with the nation's enemies, right? Go to war with them, lock them in jail, right? Prosecute them. And you could even see that, at times he would accuse, the institution, my colleagues, of treason, right? Which is not just sort of a vague charge, but a very specific one. And towards the very end of his administration, you started to see this anti-press rhetoric shifting into anti-press action. So at the very last days of the administration, the Justice Department, in apparent defiance of its own stated guidelines, secretly seized the records of a bunch of journalists from the Times, from the Post, from CNN, phone records, and they sought to seek email records as well. So you started to see real action. As he was running in the 2024 race, it was clear that he was telegraphing his intention to go after institutions like mine, after the free press, much, much more directly. And it wasn't just him. It was being echoed by his closest advisors and biggest supporters. And it was emerging in policy documents that were being prepared in anticipation of a second term. And, I felt we should take this extremely seriously. And then the question is, so how do you prepare for something like this? And the first thought I had was, well, we're not the first country in which a free press has faced this type of pressure. And there have to be lessons from the countries that have already been through this. So countries that have had a tradition of free and independent press, right? Maybe a newer tradition, maybe a more tentative tradition, but a tradition nonetheless, where they've seen the press freedoms erode along with broader democratic norms. And so me and a few colleagues, including I think one who's in the room today, Ian, spent a bunch of time digging into what we could learn, and interviewed a bunch of people from places like Hungary and India and Brazil and Poland and others to try to pull lessons, including some of the colleagues who you'll hear from later. And what was really striking to me, sorry, am I filibustering? Is this
No. Go
okay,
ahead.
All right, okay. What was really
I have my next question locked and loaded, and so I'm just waiting.
All right, okay. Feel free to jump in. But what was really clear to me was that there's a playbook, right? So there's the playbook that the mind goes.
That was my next question, by the way.
Yeah.
About the playbook.
Yeah. So I'll talk about it. So the mind naturally goes to places where the repression of the press is at its most dramatic, right? So in Russia, you can be killed for being a journalist, right? In China, you can be jailed, right? Both those places have pretty well-developed censorship apparatuses, right? That is sort of a dramatic form of repression. What we kept seeing in the playbook from other countries is a much more sort of technocratic playbook. What we compared it to in the piece is a movie that is intentionally so boring that no one wants to watch it or talk about it. And so the playbook ended up looking really consistent across these. So that, in my mind, there's basically 5 parts. Useful to go through them?
Absolutely.
So part one.
My job has been very easy today,
Nice.
but no.
I also write long, as CJR is aware. So part one is basically about attacking the legitimacy of the press, right? So this is, the type of rhetoric that I described earlier, normalizing sort of everyday harassment. I'm sure there's many journalists in the room who have been on the other side of writing a story that upset some group or some power. And really, 15 years ago, it was not as painful. It was nowhere near as painful as it is today, right? Like you can be punished in a very visceral way for that now, right? So that combination of sort of sowing distrust by attacking the legitimacy, and then the sort of normalization of harassment of journalists, right? With the goal, obviously, of provoking some self-censorship, having people opt out of those tough stories. That's phase one. The next phase is use the civil courts, right? Because the civil courts are open to anyone, right? And you don't even have to win a case in order to really punish the other side, right? So we saw...
we've seen kind of the weaponization of the legal system and kind of nuisance lawsuits and, draining resources, making people wonder if the benefit of doing a story is worth the amount of legal fees it will take to defend doing that story and so on.
Exactly. And so for us, right, in the first Trump term, we saw a historic surge in defamation and libel cases, right? Many of which were sharing lawyers, right, that were coming from a very particular political valence, right? Thankfully, we're on better financial footing than we were a decade ago. And, we have a long history of fighting those cases. If you're a smaller news organization, a single tough case can be extremely punishing. But even the cases, the losing cases, Trump once described a suit he had filed against us that he'd lost. He said something, to the effect of, look, I spent a few bucks to make their lives miserable, and they had to spend a whole bunch more. There's the model. That's the model. The third one, more troubling, right, is the actual abuse of and selective use and abuse of regulatory and other legal powers by an administration, right? So this is everything from, using regulators to go after the companies that control news organizations or that own news organizations, right? So, we saw versions of that in this country, right, where, a defense contract, was apparently Amazon was taken out of the running to sort of punish, for the Washington Post independent reporting. But you're seeing versions of that with the FCC, right? So right now that they've announced that they want to investigate a few of Trump's favorite critics, right? Or the outlets that Trump loves to criticize, and in fact, a couple he's taken to court. You see that with the selective, changes in access, right? That kicked the Associated Press out of the White House briefing room. That's a very troubling, bucket. The next part of the playbook, so those are the first three, is supporters of the administration, right, starting to use these same tactics themselves, right? And I think we'll hear from our colleagues that one of the ways to signal support to an administration that's putting this type of pressure on the free press is actually to put your own pressure on the free press. And we heard cases of folks filing lawsuits very intentionally in far-flung jurisdictions simultaneously, so that a single outlet would have to defend itself on all these multiple fronts with all this logistical complexity, or just filing tons of lawsuits. So you just have the financial burden. And then the last one, which was really striking, why are the powers that be inclined to go after the free press? Well, because we ask tough questions that they don't want to answer, because we are willing to publish information that they don't want the public to know, right? And but it's actually not just enough to make to undermine the press that's willing to do that. It's in their interest to elevate a press that's a press, right? Journalists who are not willing to do that, who are actually willing to repeat your talking points and to create a show, of journalism, that is basically just an extension of a political apparatus at the end of the day. So those are the models. And when I saw the sort of clarity of this playbook, my first instinct is, okay, that's helpful to know. This is, it's a pretty good map for where we need to plan, but also everyone else in our industry needs to understand this. And that's why I brought it to the Washington Post.
So there's a lot in there. And if we take a step back, one of the more notable things is, so this is all in the kind of official capacity. There's the additional layer of jeopardy that comes from the really excitable, not necessarily stable, super fan person. We have almost forgotten about, during the first administration, the number of media organizations that had pipe bombs sent to them, from a person who was acting kind of in a sense of zealous support of going after Donald Trump's enemies. And so there's another layer of it as well that comes from kind of non-official channels. I wonder, we're going to say
completely. And just to put a number on that, the New York Times spends 10x on physical security today than we did prior to Trump winning office in 2016. 10x.
Wow.
I used to work in a building that did not have bomb-proof ballards, bulletproof doors, armed guards, and safe rooms on every floor. Today we have every one of those things.
Wow. That's partly anticipates the question that I had next, which was, how does the New York Times operate differently in this moment as compared to previously? But I'll refine that and say, does the Times approach Trump 2 differently than it approached Trump 1?
Those are both great questions. So on the first one, in addition, so physical security has obviously become, a much bigger area of investment, and we were already probably the leading organization in terms of how much we were spending on it, particularly abroad, right? Because we've got folks in every conflict zone on Earth, and going to some of the most sort of dangerous, hard to reach places. We had 3 reporters who spent the better part of a year trying to get to the parts of Afghanistan that the U.S. military had struggled to get to actually understand how did the U.S. military fail in this conflict, and spent much of a year there, right? So the physical security investments, huge. But I actually had a moment, God, it must be about 5 years ago now, where I called a colleague of mine, Cliff Levy, one of the great editors at the Times, and who at that point was overseeing standards and helping with questions of security, and just said, it feels to me like we have developed over 100 years, 150 years, right? A best-in-class playbook for supporting you as a journalist when you are in a dangerous place. And we can't take the risk out of a war zone, but we can arm you with a playbook of how to handle each moment, about how to think about risk, and we can make you feel like the arms of the institution are around you at every turn, right? So for example, our folks in Ukraine, they don't go anywhere without a personal security team. And we have very specific rules about how many people can be in a single car, just all sorts of, so it's a best-in-class playbook that we refined over generations. And I said, I think that our journalists are now facing a new kind of pressure emerging from digital spaces that we have no playbook for. And it doesn't get as immediately to questions of safety, although questions of safety there, but it really gets to feelings of security and confidence and your own personal confidence in your ability to do your work. When you're getting, and these are not exaggerated numbers, hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of messages, racist, misogynistic, right? Often, many of them will include overt death threats or implicit threats against family members. And then we see those harassment campaigns start to actually shift into the real world. People are doxxed. People are swatted, which means, that the police are called to storm their houses in the middle of the night, with fake crimes. People are accused of crimes they didn't commit and have to spend time clearing their names. And then, if you're one of the journalists who just, you just got that steel in your spine and you persevere through each of those obstacles, then they start going after your family. And all of a sudden, your spouse's boss is asking your husband or wife, hey, like, this is getting a little crazy here because we're getting so many calls. Or your parents are saying, hey, look, is this line of reporting really that important? Or your kid's school. So, that form is entirely new. We actually stood up two different teams, one for surveillance, right? So cybersecurity, and another for that sort of mix of just how to respond, how we can make you feel like the arms of the institution are around you when you're being harassed. So that is the biggest sort of, shift in how we're thinking about security in this moment.
Yeah, I think one of the things that on our side of it at the journalism school is, one of our centers here, one of our important institutions is the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and which has been
we work with you guys quite a bit.
We work together on things, and so they've pioneered these questions about how journalists, starting with how journalists can do the work that we do without inflicting further trauma on the people who we talk to, or the people who are at the centers of the story we cover, and so on, only to evolve into the recognition that we had to actually understand how journalists ourselves are processing these kinds of traumas. And now in the digital space and the kind of vulnerability that you're talking about, this is making that work even more relevant, more pertinent. I do wonder if there's dialogue in your shop between the people who have covered Afghanistan or worked in Afghanistan, people who have been in Iraq, the people who've been in hostile places that are hostile to journalists, and people who are doing domestic coverage in the United States now.
Yeah, there is. And like I said, we actually tried very overtly to pull the best lessons of like what institutional support feels like. And if you talk to our colleagues in Ukraine right now, they'll say we had 50 journalists on the ground in Ukraine last year, 50 separate journalists. Some of them were 100 yards from Russian front lines, right? So they are like right there, very much in harm's way. And they'll say, it feels risky, but they will also tell you, and I know this because I'm constantly fishing for what we could do better to support them, that they feel like the arms of the institutions are around them. And so we've tried really to port over those lessons to folks who are experiencing a different type of thing. It's either the harassment, and just like seeing the ugliness. Like we had one colleague who was getting so much physical hate mail that she had to actually just come up with an arrangement with the postman where he would leave a physical postman's basket each day with her, and then she would go through it, and the next day she'd leave the empty one, and he'd have the next day's 700 letters of threats, right? And so we're trying to port that over. And so, yeah, we're in constant dialogue. And, for our folks who have been through the ringer on the harassment side, they say that the program today feels qualitatively different than a couple of years ago. And it's one of the things I'm prouder of. Now, that said, it still requires just a ton of personal resilience, right? A ton. Like I talk to reporters who tell me that they know when they are going to write a story that the price they will pay for this story is a harassment campaign that may do permanent damage to their reputation, right? And this isn't just affecting the powers that be, right? This isn't just when you report on, Trump or Modi, right? Or Biden, right? This is also the case when you're reporting on powerful institutions, right? Institutions in Silicon Valley, activist causes, right? Like, just the ability to get a mass of people to go after a single person has really intensified.
I think our kind of one iteration of this that we're dealing with at the journalism school is kind of the confluence or kind of overlap of these areas, in that we have student journalists, we have a significant number of international students, and so now we're trying to navigate the ways in which we can protect our international students for their reporting, because people have conflated reporting with all sorts of other nefarious undertakings. And this is not kind of ad hoc, this is not kind of random people who are weaponizing the internet. These are people with very powerful positions in government. And so on each kind of layer, I always talk with people saying that we've seen this administration attack academia and attack news organizations, and we are a news organization that exists in academia. And so we have the kind of Venn overlap of both of those things.
That sounds hard. I don't often sit down on a stage with someone and say, I'm glad I don't have that job.
So the funny thing, I will tell you a funny kind of conversation, which is that during the pandemic, I talked with my predecessor, Steve Cole, who was guiding the school through all of the things that happened with COVID-19. And I started the conversation by saying to him, if there's one job in America I don't want, Steve, it's yours.
That's great.
Fast forward a few years, and I actually have that job. And as things begin to unfold, I spoke to Steve, I guess, about 3 weeks ago, and he said, Jelani, if there's one job in America that I don't want. But either way, this is really not, like the brunt of it is not on my shoulders. Like, really, the brunt of it is on the shoulders of, like, my students and my faculty and all the people.
Completely.
Yeah, and so, Marty Barron, who's in the audience here.
Was Marty here? Oh.
Yeah, he's right here. Marty told me something when I started this job that, he'd gleaned from his positions of leadership, saying that as a leader, your job is to create the circumstances under which your people can do their best work. And that's really what we're trying to talk about, the circumstances in which American journalists are still able to do their best work.
Can I say one beat on that? Because the thing about talking about press freedom, right, is, especially when you're the publisher at the Times or dean of Columbia Journalism School, right, it sounds inherently self-serving. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to remember that press freedom is actually a freedom for the people, right?
That's right.
It is the freedom to be informed, right? About what is happening in your nation, right, and in the broader world, and I really think that as press freedom comes under increasing pressure, and as we make the case that it matters, I think pulling people back to this is about you having access to the free flow of reliable information. Right.
So this is about the information necessary for active citizenship.
That's right. And this is about you having this other check and balance in the system, that if people, if your elected leaders or other powers that be, prove incompetent or corrupt, right? That you have a channel to find out about that. You have people who are asking those questions, whose job it is to ask those questions every day and to bring you the answers. And I do think that as a profession, we still need to make sure that we're not allowing people to lose sight that this is really about an informed public more than anything.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. I think I want to go back to a kind of practice question, which is that
journalistic practice. Because I'm basically a bureaucrat at this
journalistic
point.
Practice, but I mean in terms of, I should say, like organizational practice or kind of the protocols of this moment. What I mean by that most specifically is that one of the more notable examples of this kind of marginalization or this kind of punitive approach to the media is what we've seen with the AP. For refusing to adopt, really a kind of whim of the president that we should rename an entire body of water just because he thinks so, they've been punished, and refused access to the White House briefing room, refused access to Air Force One, in theory inhibiting their ability to do their work as journalists. They chose to pursue a legal response, which has yielded a successful result.
Well, somewhat. I mean,
Somewhat,
some
right?
encouraging signs.
There are some
so
encouraging
far.
signs.
Yeah.
It's complicated. But one of the things that was notable to me was that other news organizations still went to the White House briefing room, or other news organizations still traveled on Air Force One. And, I wonder if the response to this is that if everyone can't come in, no one comes in, or how we should operate differently in this moment.
So let me say a couple things. The first, first of all, I have a great deal of admiration for how the AP handled this case, right? They could have put their head down and just, hoped that the attention would drift somewhere else at some point, but they felt a fundamental right and principle had been violated, and they felt that the system would validate their concern, and then they put the question into the system, right? They didn't take it for granted. They stood by their rights, and I think they deserve a great deal of credit for it. The first thing implicit in your question, right? News outlets, we compete, right? We're competitors. We compete for stories. We compete like hell for stories. We compete sometimes for talent, right? But we actually have a really great record of not competing on this, on the cause of press freedom, right? When we were kicked out of China a few years back, my first call was to the publisher of the Washington Post and the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. And for the first time in any of our organization's histories, we issued a joint statement and took out joint advertisements and to protest the moves, to raise concerns about it, and then jointly, met with the government to raise our concerns. Similarly, I mentioned, when our records were secretly seized at the end of Trump's term, when it finally came out that our records were among those, the Washington Post and CNN, who were also in that group, immediately reached out to me and said, we're actually going to the Justice Department to give the Attorney General a hard time to demand answers and to push for reforms. Do you want to come? And so we all did that together. Bruce Brown, who you're going to hear from later, was part of that meeting. And it yielded important reforms, fragile reforms, but important ones. And so, and I could go, back further, the Pentagon Papers, right? When we were shut down from publishing the Pentagon Papers, who picked it up? It was the Washington Post. So the track record of news organizations coming together is really important and must continue. With Access, when Fox was kicked out under Obama, or when we were kicked out and Trump won.
Well, you note that Obama made note of that. The reaction when Fox was kicked out was more vociferous than the reaction to when AP.
I'm going to get there, I promise. And in Fox, we stood up for Fox. Fox stood up for us, right? When Trump tried to pull a similar trick and Trump won. So what happened when they got kicked out? First thing, we put out a strongly worded public statement, right? Supporting the AP and decrying the move. I immediately called the head of the AP. Our lawyers immediately called theirs with the basic statement, what can we do to help? There is an important difference I just want to point out that between this moment and the last two. And the important difference is that the Trump administration has already brought a swath of the media ecosystem that stands strongly behind him into the room, right? And so I think that that immediately raises questions, right? what would the implication? So with Obama, right? If everyone agreed to step aside, it's just silence, right? What does it look like a world in which, say, NBC, right, and the Washington Post, and the New York Times, right, and the New Yorker, right, all step outside, and then Newsmax and Breitbart and the Daily Wire, and I could keep going down the list. Step in to fill the void.
It looks like he can only get the C list.
Yeah. So that's a completely reasonable bet. But the thing that I would say about this administration is they have been more clever about seeing around corners. And there are stories that I can't share in front of a large group, where the
overlap of our jobs,
easy,
right?
obvious answer, which, an institution like mine is sort of inclined to any show of support, obvious, forceful show of support for our colleagues in the press, will sometimes backfire. And I just think that we need to be open to that and seeing around corners. In fact, I hope our colleague from Hungary will talk a little bit about the moments, I think, that the lessons he learned about sometimes the easy, obvious thing about sort of like, you can't do this to the free press, actually making it easier to further the crackdowns against it.
So first, we're going to have time, for people to ask questions. We have microphone in the center. And so if you're formulating your questions or thinking about your questions, we'll throw to you shortly. But I wanted to kind of move a little bit forward. Are there things that you see strategically that are working in this moment? Or kind of throwing things against the wall and saying, okay, we actually have this has yielded positive results for how we navigate this moment?
I don't think, let me say two things. I don't think we know where the press freedom story goes in this country, right? We've seen really worrying lessons that should sober us from our colleagues abroad, right? We also have something that they didn't, which is a 250-year tradition, bipartisan tradition of a free press, right? It was a rare point of consensus among the nation's founders, right? Was the importance of a press. Jefferson famously said, "I'd rather have a press without a government than a government without a press," or something to that effect. And that consensus has only grown. This last century, it's like you look at points of consensus in the Supreme Court, the expansion of First Amendment protections has been high on that list. And the First Amendment is the sort of strongest governing document of press freedom that we see anywhere in the world. So, one, I want us to have confidence in the system, right? For the system to hold, we need to believe in it, and we need to be willing to test it, right? And when I say test it, I mean to take the questions, to take what we believe are unjust exercises of power, abuses of power, and put them into the system and say, that's not how we think this works, right? In this country, right? Where are the courts going to go? I also think that we need to prepare our folks, right? Like, I have so much admiration for my colleagues right now who are, I believe, producing the greatest body of accountability reporting ever produced on a single figure by any news organization, any one individual, right? And they're keeping up with this fire hose, right? But they're not just keeping up with the fire hose. And Joe Kahn, our executive editor, said this thing that was so clarifying to me. He said, I think of ourselves as the paper of record again. So we used to think of ourselves as the paper of record. It's this old phrase because we literally logged the coming and going of every boat in New York Harbor, right, in like the 1850s. And, as recently as, 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, we were still reviewing every movie that showed on a single screen in New York, right? Wow. And it was like, that's what paper record was. It was like all of it. And then the internet started doing things like that better, right? And so we decided we were going to be the paper that sort of helped put the major stuff on the record, but we would investigate, we would contextualize, right? It was a little less of that sort of just like on the record thing. in this moment in which this administration is using power as aggressively as we've seen certainly since Roosevelt, right, and maybe longer, he feels an obligation that that one institution in American life is getting it all on the record, right? So you could just see, especially if you read the actual physical paper, just page after page after page of story that in any other administration, each of them would have led the paper, and probably not for a day, but for a week, maybe a couple months. So we're trying to do that, the paper of record approach, while simultaneously, and this is where I feel so grateful for the resources that we're able to put behind these stories, simultaneously circling back and doing that more modern New York Times thing, investigating the hell. How did this happen? Who was involved? Did any of them want to make money off it, right? Like all those questions, circling back to contextualize, right? Like, what does this mean, right? This seems like a small thing, but is it actually a big thing? Let's talk to the scholars, the academics, right? The lawyers. And then circling back to connect the dots. These may seem like disparate things, but they are all about a broader pattern of X or Y or Z. So that's how we're approaching this moment. Now, the colleagues who are doing that work are doing it knowing that they're in a more fragile press ecosystem than they've been in, that their sources are more vulnerable, that they themselves may be more vulnerable. So it's really impossible for me to overstate my admiration for the work that's being done.
I mean, I think it's also true that, I mean, if you took away all of the noise, and the noise is substantial, but if you just went story for story, people would make an argument that this is a golden age of journalism, irrespective of things, because not so much the stories themselves. I mean, the story that's important, but what the press has done in its weakened state with the limitations on revenue and far fewer people even working in the field of journalism. But if you were just compiling important stories and important investigations, especially I'd say in the first 2 years of Trump 1, it's breaking story after breaking story after breaking story from outlet after outlet after outlet. The Times with its kind of outsized footprint in American journalism, we know, but even kind of medium-sized organizations and digital-only organizations and like news popping up from seemingly every crack in the sidewalk, where people can find any valence whatsoever, they're using it to actually report on what's happening around them. And I think it's important for us in this moment where we're literally talking about the threats that we face to also, to your point, look at what people have done in the midst of this context. I think it would be a really big mistake to not take note of that.
That almost sounded optimistic.
I didn't know. I don't think we're in the optimism business. I think
we
we're not
are
allowed.
Not, but it did. I was inspired.
Yeah.
No, I really agree. I really agree. I think there's a lot of great journalism being done in this country right now, and it's part of why I think like we should plan, right? And we should be prepared. We should not panic. We need to keep doing what we're doing, which I believe is protected by the First Amendment, by the Constitution, and I believe ultimately has the support of this country.
So I have questions. I have questions about New York Times versus Sullivan. I have a bunch of questions, but what I'll do is open the floor. There's a microphone right here. Wait. That's still. Okay. So there's a microphone right there. I will occasionally throw in one of my questions. We'll mix them in here. But I will say I have a couple of things that I do before I open any microphone. The first is to request that people speak as succinctly as possible so that we can get as many questions in as possible. The other is that I offer a definition. It's just a question is an interrogative sentence, generally denoted by the inflection at the end. It differs from a statement in that a statement offers information and a question requests it. We would prefer questions to statements. And if you frame this, I say this to everyone, so people know this speech by this point. And it's not directed at you. It's directed to the person next to you who needs guidance on this. And so if we can keep all of those things in mind, I actually should trademark that because I think people have used it, like taking it to other.
I'm going to steal that one. That's my favorite line of yours since you said it's sort of like bringing a knife to a gunfight,
Right.
But at least that's better than bringing a bottle of wine because you thought it was a dinner party.
Yeah, exactly. Like the person who brings a knife to a gunfight at least knows they're in a fight. And the person who brings a bottle of wine is like, hey, why is everybody shooting at each other? Like, what's happening here? So we will jump in with our questions and we'll entertain them as much as we can.
Good afternoon. I'm Claudia Dreyfus.
Can you tilt the mic down a little bit? Yeah, okay.
For Joel.
Turn it on.
Oh yeah, I think
I'm Claudia Dreyfus. It's not on.
No,
Is it?
turn it on.
yeah.
Turn it on.
Okay.
Much better.
All right, much better.
Good
All right.
afternoon. I'm Claudia Dreyfus. I teach journalism at the School of Professional Studies. And my question, and it is a question, is do you feel that the institutions of what we called in the 60s the establishment, the press, the law, higher education, that people really understood what they were up against? And are we really facing the dangers accurately? And finally, I'd like to ask, what are some practical things we can all do now, given this emergency situation, to counter what we're up against?
Can I jump in with this? I'll take the first half of that. And
Is that a question?
That is. And if you want to jump in, so there's a couple things. One is that I think American institutions have taken democracy for granted, I think. And they've also taken their own safety for granted. And what I mean by that, and I'm speaking about a whole wide array of institutions, is that we are ill prepared to navigate a moment like this, partly because we've never conceived of being in a moment like this. There are also things we did that didn't help. In higher education, the obscene cost of education has made us exceedingly vulnerable in ways that we haven't grappled with. And so when people attack us, people think, well, this is a place that I can't afford, or that people wind up in, all kinds of debt, trying to pursue education. They don't think of higher education as a stairway to a better life in the way that previous generations did. I think that journalism and higher education, just leaving those two, we're just talking about those two because there are others we could bring into this. We have also been uniquely bad at telling our own story. Journalists excel at telling others, the stories of others, but the reason, we were talking about this in the elevator, today I have been going through an exceedingly proctological fact check from the New Yorker. And so, it's true, like we're working on a story and like questions come back and questions come back and questions come back. That's not part of the story. Like nobody except for the journalists in this room know what that's like. Other people think that we just make something up and send it out into the world. And we haven't protected ourselves by familiarizing the public with what our processes actually are. In higher education, people will just say, okay, there's $400 million being taken from Columbia University. Let's talk a little bit about what some of that money was being used to do. Columbia's Global Center is responsible for delivering HIV medication, I think it's like 17 countries or some such, to prevent the spread and proliferation of HIV/AIDS. We had cancer research that protocols studies were being conducted, stopped in the middle. There was a study on the efficacy of particular drugs for infants with liver disease. Stopped in the middle of it. All of the pro bono work that happens at the law school, all of the things, the ways in which universities are engaged in the work of pursuing a better life for human beings. We don't tell that story. Most people don't know that unless you work if you're familiar with the internal allotment of funds at a university. And so having not done that, we find ourselves vulnerable when we are demagogically attacked by people who just weaponize the ignorance around what it is that we actually do.
Can I just add to that? So I agree with everything you said, and particularly telling the story, right, and the importance of explaining, not taking trust for granted, not regarding trust as implicit, but trust is something that actually has to be earned all the time, and to earn it, you need to show a bit more about process and values. That said, just to complicate it one beat, I also think it's important to recognize that institutions, even if there are unjust or even illegal attacks on certain institutions, that there are good reasons to question institutions too,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah, no, I know
Absolutely.
you're not.
Yeah.
I know you're not arguing against it, but I think it's just important, right? We have to have curiosity about that. Like one of the rare points of consensus that stretches from the farthest right to the farthest left, which I think we've learned is a little bit of a circle, is real questions about, how can the world's most expensive military keep losing wars? How can the world's most expensive healthcare system have some of the worst results in the developed world, right? How can the world's greatest economy feel increasingly unequal, right? Even in our industry, media, right? The number of working reporters has plummeted over generations, right? Even as like the number of sort of hot takes and lazy punditry, right, has surged, right? So the media ecosystem, if you think media as an institution, actually is less worthy of people's trust. So institutions do need to be challenged, and so I think anyone who's looking at this moment should have curiosity about some of the underlying questions, right, and then a lot of skepticism about a lot of the tactics, right. And that includes looking at ourselves as an institution. So I think I don't think the answer is just sort of like reflexive defense of institutions. I don't think there's many people in the country who don't have some profound critiques, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that goes to the heart of kind of making the whole circle of like what we're supposed to be doing as journalists. And even kind of holding ourselves up to scrutiny as an institution, but also recognizing that other institutions, even well-meaning institutions, have to be examined, and scrutiny is ultimately beneficial. We have the next question.
Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Eric Santamaro Stenzel. I'm a student here at the journalism school. As our speaker mentioned at the beginning, in part, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 176 journalists and media workers have been killed in Israel, occupied Palestinian territories, and Lebanon since October 7th, 2023. Almost all of these deaths have been Palestinian journalists, many being killed by the Israeli military, in many cases with explicit targeting. So my question is, why hasn't this been part of your discussion about press freedom here on this stage?
Yeah. I mean, look, you're exactly right. This is the deadliest year on record for journalists in the world. It's also, we've been at or near records for basically 5 or 6 years on the number of journalists jailed. So this is, we've been talking about a more sort of technocratic playbook that's emerged in countries like Hungary and Brazil and India, and how that's being applied here. But there is also, a much deadlier effort that's, occurring elsewhere in the world. I think our colleague from CPJ is here. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Is Jody here? I thought she was. Jody's not here. Oh, she didn't make it. Oh, okay. Yeah, so CPJ, has been doing great work on this front, and the Times, we have supported a bunch of the work there. We've got folks on the ground, and have had to, move heaven and earth to provide the support we can. As you know, it's incredibly difficult to get people or supplies into Gaza right now, and we've also moved heaven and earth to get some folks who are in harm's way out. So I'm really glad for your attention to this.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think that this has been, a topic we've dealt with, in multiple ways at the journalism school since the kind of beginning of it. I think this is a topic that always warrants more attention, because this is, first off, in the context of journalists who are being killed, we're seeing that even when you take Gaza completely out of the equation, there's a global spike in the number of journalists who've been killed in the last 2 years. So I have to have that correct. And so this is the worst instance of a overall bad, even worsening environment. And that needs to be highlighted and discussed. And so we actually have been working on something at CJR, can't really get into all of it, but we've been working on ways to actually point more attention to that issue in its primacy.
Thank you. Meghnad Bose from CJR here, also an Indian journalist. My question to you is, if 232 journalists had been killed by Russia in Ukraine or by Iran in the United States, would it or would it not have had coverage that is far greater in amount of newsprint given, words, photos, number of stories, and the sheer editorial priority than what the New York Times has accorded the 232 journalists killed by Israel in Gaza, as per the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs at Brown University? And in that same vein, do you consider it tone deaf or complicit that Columbia Journalism School and the New York Times are co-organizing an event today on the fight for global press freedom without a single Palestinian journalist, either from Gaza, the West Bank, or the diaspora, or even a perspective on Palestine in the schedule that was announced and promoted by the school and the Times? Thank you.
I'll go first this time. So, no, I think the initial program was organized specifically around AG's op-ed. So to tell you how the event came about, this was not an idea that we would exclude those perspectives, but when I reached out to AG and said, I read the op-ed and said, can we turn that into a public discussion? Can we take the format of what you wrote and turn it into a program that will explore those very themes? We then expanded the program to make sure that we did have representation of voices to discuss the very specific things that have happened in Gaza. And so that was how the conversation evolved and developed. And I think that, to your point, we have raised this point in statement after statement, in multiple statements at the journalism school. There's more that can be done, but I also think it's notable that the journalism school is the only school at Columbia that made mention of Mahmoud Khalil's arrest and the implications for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so there's more. I'm not saying that we, have kind of met the bar, but I think that there's a whole array of different ways that we can be, working to highlight what's going on here. And I think that our journalist colleagues around the world and our journalist colleagues in Gaza, we also had Motaz Aziza here, which, I don't actually think we should I don't want to say pin a medal on my chest for this, but we took heat for that. And we were prepared to take heat for that, but we did it. And so, no, we're not perfect. We can do more, but we have done some things in an effort to make sure that we highlight this issue.
And the only thing I'll add is I think that my colleagues have done extraordinary coverage of that conflict, of the other conflicts you mentioned, under the most challenging conditions. We've got dozens of people who have been, dedicating years now to covering this conflict and to illuminating every side of it and the reality, and not just illuminating it, but investigating it, right? Much of what the world knows about Israel's, how they've conducted this war is actually from the pages of the New York Times, which is why we won a Pulitzer for that coverage last year. So I think my colleagues have done extraordinary work.
I'll also commend you for asking a difficult question of your own dean in public, because that's what you should do. I'm dead serious. I'm absolutely serious. Like, these are the types of journalists we train, to not defer to anyone's authority, to ask, people who are, in a position, I don't know, to make it more difficult for you to graduate. But to stand up and ask that question in public, and so thank you for that.
Mr. Sulzberger, thank you for being here today. Cobb, thank you for facilitating the conversation. I'm also a student here at Columbia Journalism School, and I actually also had a question about the coverage of the Gaza war. Specifically, it's about Screams Without Words. The New York Times received a lot of scrutiny regarding the coverage of the sexual attacks that happened in southern Israel on October 7th. And it was sort of notable that, to my understanding, that report was not part of the coverage that was submitted to the Pulitzer Prizes. My question to you is whether the reason for the omission of that report as part of the Pulitzer Prizes package was due to a level of insecurity about the quality of the reporting that was done for Screams Without Words, or whether the paper today stands by that report.
First of all, thank you for the question in the same spirit as you just shared. Look, I have literally no idea what stories are being submitted or not as part of Pulitzer packages, so I can't speak to that. I don't know whether that one was included or not. What I can speak to is I'm aware that story has been as directly challenged as just about anything that we've produced over the course of this conflict. Although it is not the only story that's been challenged. We're getting challenged by, not both sides, but every side of this conflict. And often you have multiple sides of the conflict challenging the exact same story from the exact opposite direction. So we know the level of scrutiny that's going to be applied to everything that we write about this. And that's a reflection of, its importance, right? It's also a reflection, that it's a zero-sum conflict, that with roots that stretch back not just years, but not just generations, right, but millennia, right? So, so we absolutely, I think that was an incredibly important body of work that was produced by my colleagues. I think every part of it has been, or virtually every part of it has been confirmed in other reporting by other outlets or by the UN itself. And I'm aware that it continues to be contested, much the same way that our reporting on the erosion of freedoms for Palestinians and the sort of direct campaigns in the West Bank has been challenged in Israel. We were the organization that was able to expose and document the widespread use of 2,000-pound bombs that had never been used at any significant scale on the ground in Gaza. In the context of urban warfare, they had never been used. More recently, we exposed how the Israeli military had how the Israelis had intentionally lowered the threshold for civilian deaths in that country over the objection of some of their own generals, right? So those are the type of stories that are also being produced in the New York Times and also being contested just by a different group of people. And we're reporting on atrocities that Hamas committed, on the October 7th attack, in its treatment of hostages since the conflict. And what I would say is, I think it's important to be a news organization that intends to bring you the whole story, right? Even if parts of it don't perfectly align. And we intend, with your preferences or your assumptions, and the New York Times intends to be a place that will bring you the whole story, even when it's uncomfortable for you, even when it's uncomfortable for us.
Thank you.
Are you all cold? Yeah, okay, we're working on it. I just sent a message to someone.
Just a very short follow-up. I was wondering if you could speak to the level of access that the Israeli Defense Forces had to give to do some of that reporting, especially at the start of the war, and whether that is something that has been an issue in, for instance, submitting the coverage package for the New York Times, for the Pulitzer Prizes, I'm sorry. Thank you.
I can't speak to like any prize entry package. I'm just not involved in that type of work in any way. What I can say is, the Israeli government is, placed extraordinary and persistent restrictions on access from outside journalists since the start of the war. That, we have privately protested, we've publicly protested, and the moments in which we have gone in, with Israeli troops, we have made that absolutely transparent. And if you listen to some of the dailies that emerge from that reporting, or read some of the articles, it's not only transparent. It is actually independent journalists at its finest. It's folks coming in, asking the toughest questions, pushing back on assertions from the military, asking the questions that they don't want to ask. So look, we are, our job is to ask the tough questions of everyone. And I don't think anyone can make a good faith argument that we have not been willing to persistently report the toughest stories on Israel and its conduct in this war.
For the last two questions, because we're running short on time, can you ask those questions sequentially, and then we'll deal with both of them at the same time? Okay, if you could ask them like succinctly, and then we can try to get in answers to both of them.
Okay, thank you, Dean Cobb. I will try to put context in a frame of a question as well. I'm a teacher at Columbia, and having campaigned in this presidential election in other states, particularly purple states, I constantly heard the refrain, I'm not going to vote because I don't know what the truth is on either side. And so as you, the New York Times, and as us, educators and activists, think how we're going to do things differently, I would like to ask New York Times, your clientele, your base, including me, who is one of your readers, is of a certain type. But there's a gap. It's not reaching other parts of this country. As you restructure and think in this context of attacks on First Amendment, does New York Times feel they have an obligation to reach beyond this certain base of readers of New York Times, to reach pockets of this country that are not getting the message? And how will New York Times, in this period, in this climate of First Amendment attacks, deal with proactively addressing fake media?
Can I just take that one quickly, just because otherwise I'll forget some of the details. Look, thanks for the question. I mean, let me say a couple of things. The first one is, I think that old sort of like caricature of the New York Times and the New York Times reader is like being like Uncle Sal on the Upper West Side isn't, I think the facts have moved beyond it, right? So like, California is actually where we had the most readers and subscribers. After New York, Texas and Florida are next on the list. So like our readership, the places where our readership has been growing fastest is the South and the Midwest. So we are really reaching a much, much broader group of people and more diverse in every way, right? Millions of rural readers, right? Racially diverse, in terms of income, right? Much more diverse, right? So we're really proud of that. And I have a theory of why that is. I think that the media ecosystem has really evolved to scratch whatever itch you have, right? To find what you want and to give you more. We know that social media is literally structured to do that, right? But media organizations have learned to survive in an era dominated by social media. Just go straight for that specific thing that people want to hear from you. Mm-hmm. And I think the most underserved news consumer is the news consumer who's willing and in fact demands to hear the whole story. And even when it pushes in ways that they don't want, and so I think in that is a core lesson, right? Like, I think independence has only become a more essential journalistic principle in an era that is as polarized and tribalized and factionalized as this one, right? I think we need to model, in a moment in which the country has lost the ability to understand itself, and listen to sort of post-election commentary. It's like, I don't believe that he could win that much. I don't know a single Trump voter. I don't believe that Biden could have won. I don't know a single Biden voter. This country has self-sorted geographically. It's self-sorted algorithmically, and I think news organizations, particularly news organizations like mine that have a real commitment to diversity in our ranks, and to being on the ground in the country everywhere, and to understanding where people come from and their hopes and their fears, I think that we can play a really important role in helping build that understanding. But look, we are also simultaneously being called the enemy of the people by the leader of one of America's two parties, right? Things like that, have consequences. The tech giants are simultaneously downranking serious news, right, and elevating, figures and institutions unworthy of your trust. So there are real headwinds. So I think that we should regard that sort of teaching America to value, a broader swath of America to value independent journalism. I think that's probably a generation-long project.
Mm-hmm. My 30-second addendum to that is that, I'm fond of pointing out that even when newspapers were flush with cash, we still published horoscopes. Because the things that people, we like to imagine that, in the golden age, people were just there for hard-hitting investigation. We busted a congressman last week. This week we got a city council member. Then we're going to just kind of give you hard-hitting investigation after and people were really coming to us for that. But the fact of it was that people came for sports, they came for horoscopes, they came for romantic advice columns, they came for all of those things. And newspapers, if we're talking specifically about papers, were a kind of one-size-fits-all thing that gave you all kinds of information and entertainment, and also would let you know if your city councilman was taking envelopes of cash. And Joseph Pulitzer, who certainly oversaw, important journalism, but the great innovation of his papers was the way that they greatly enhanced the number of cartoonists that they had on staff. And people loved the cartoons in the New York world. So, there's that part of it. And those things tend to cut across lines. The people who are interested in horoscopes don't necessarily all vote for the same candidate.
Can I just piggyback? I mean, honestly, it's as if you worked at the New York Times.
I'm the only person in this room who did not.
It's why we bought Wordle. It's why we bought The Athletic, which is the largest newsroom of sports journalists in the English language. Mm-hmm. at a moment in which the tech giants are retreating from their responsibility for directing attention towards what matters, right? We feel like having those other things, right? I think of it as like the dessert at the health food restaurant, right?
Right.
Will bring more people in, through the door to eat our healthy food, right? And be a funnel where we can build relationships where someone might start because they're a Houston Astros fan, but then they might realize that they
which
actually
would be
really value the
a
coverage.
terrible thing to be in life in general.
Probably picked the wrong room for that one.
Right. Can you ask your question?
Okay. Hi, my
We
name is.
will answer this in top speed, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure.
So.
My name is Indy. I'm an alum, and as an international student on OPT, I'm freelancing, and we're getting advice to like self-censor and not write about Trump and pro-Palestinian protests, which is exactly what I've covered last year and I'm covering now. I was wondering, what kind of advice would you give to freelancers, to international people who are not part of like one of the legacy media outlets? And then for Jelani Cobb, I'm wondering, in how far is the Columbia Journalism School committed to protecting their alums as well?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question again. But one of the things that we have been working on, is quietly trying to kind of coordinate our legal strategies around people who are in exactly your position. We don't have anything that we can announce just yet, but we should tell you that we are actively working on this. And so we believe that, any incursion into people's ability to report is ultimately a kind of slippery slope into an incursion of any of our ability to report. So, we take that very seriously, and the best I can say is that we are working on it. And, to reiterate my comments and clarify my comments from earlier, the journalism school is prepared to do everything in our power to protect the ability of our students and our alumni to do their reporting. And we should be mindful of exactly the scale of the threat that we are navigating. But we are what we've always been, which is steadfast in our belief in our defense of the First Amendment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have so much admiration for the work that you and freelance colleagues are doing. The same is true in war zones, right? War zones tend to be deadliest for freelancers, right, that don't have the protection of a big institution behind them. I will not be the best person to ask that question, but one of the best is actually sitting here in the front row, Bruce Brown, and you should, during this break, find a time to connect with him, just because of his legal background. So, thanks.
So I want to say thank you to AG. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming out. We will reconvene in about 15 minutes with the next panel. You should come back in about 15 minutes for the next panel. And I'd like to say thank you for coming out.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
We're going to resume in just a few minutes. I know the snacks in the other room are really great. I know we're still warming. The room takes a little while to warm up, but we have addressed it. It just takes a while for it to get warmer. So our next session is a discussion with journalists about navigating this landscape. And it will be moderated by our colleague and faculty member at the journalism school, Sheila Coronel. So Sheila deserves applause. Thank you. And so I will now turn the mic over to Sheila to introduce the panel.
Thank you, Jelani. Welcome back, everyone. So this, in this panel we brought, and we're very honored to be on the same stage as 4 journalists who've really been at the front lines of defending press freedom in their countries and doing brave reporting despite the threats to their safety, their mental health, and to the democracy in which, the countries in which they live. We all know that journalists are threatened because they are independent and critical voices, and the first thing that autocrats do is to attempt to muzzle and crush, and also to destabilize and dehumanize those voices. We've heard in the previous session about the playbook that authoritarian and populist leaders use to suppress the media. We're going to hear in this session the actual experiences, real world, on the ground experiences of journalists who've experienced those threats and have not been fazed and are fighting back. So very proud and very honored really to have these 4 journalists with us today. I'll start by introducing Juliana Dal Piva. Juliana is from Brazil, and if you haven't heard about her, she's taken on Jair Bolsonaro, the previous president of Brazil. Her podcast revealing the corruption and other misbehavior of the former Brazilian head of state really went viral, and Juliana has suffered the consequences of that. Multiple threats on her, legal, doxing, etc., etc. The entire playbook has been thrown on her. Juliana has worked as a journalist for many years, and she's reported on political corruption and the legacy of Brazil's military dictatorship. She continues to report on issues of the public interest and government accountability despite all of this. She's currently now with CLIP, which is the Latin American Center for Investigative Reporting. Next to Juliana is Siddarth Varadarajan. He's an Indian journalist and editor recognized for his work in independent and investigative media. He was editor of The Hindu and is a founding editor of The Wire, which is a prominent digital news platform in India. Throughout his career, Siddarth has reported on major political and social issues. In 2002, he edited a book on the Gujarat riots and investigations into government surveillance and political affairs. At The Wire, he has faced multiple police complaints and legal actions for reporting on sensitive topics. Next to Siddarth is my colleague at the journalism school, Aida Alami. Aida is a Moroccan journalist. She's the James Madison visiting professor here this year and next year. She's known for her in-depth coverage of migration, human rights, and North African affairs. Her work has been carried out under challenging conditions. She has faced persistent threats of digital surveillance, making both her work and her sources vulnerable. As a female journalist, she has experienced online harassment and trolling. And despite all of these, like all of the others, Alami continues to report and to advocate for press freedom in countries where the press is in great danger. And finally, András, I cannot pronounce your last name, Pethő. is a co-founder and executive director of Direct 36, which is an investigative journalism center in Hungary. Nearly, if you didn't know, nearly all news organizations in Hungary are controlled by the government or by politically well-connected businessmen. Direct 36 is one of the few remaining independent journalist organizations in Hungary. During his 20-year career, András was a senior editor for the Hungarian news site Origo. He worked for the BBC News Service and was in the investigative unit of the Washington Post. He's been involved in international collaborations like the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here in Fortress Columbia. I'd like to start off by asking each of you, just to lay the groundwork out there, of what kind of describe the general context and nature of the threats you face. And from there, in our next part of the discussion, I'd like to talk about fighting back against those threats. But for the benefit of our audience, I think they'd like to know concretely what it's like to be out there in Rio or Sao Paulo, in Delhi, in Rabat, or in Budapest, facing these threats on a daily basis. Juliana, let's start with you, because you took on Jair Bolsonaro, who doesn't love the media and who has taken extreme actions against independent journalists like you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here to share this story. I would like to say that I never thought I would be here to speak about this subject. Maybe one day to share my work, not the consequences of it. But try to resume like 7 years of this journey. And I started to investigate Bolsonaro at 2018. So many things happened since then. There is one, I was just telling you, after the podcast, was the first time that I got like proof of what was happening. He has a lawyer who is a very difficult person, to say the minimum. And he was the one who used it to threaten me because of my work. I was investigating a very long corruption scheme that Bolsonaro had with his sons for like 30 years, and nobody had broken that story until 2009, while he was in presidency. And before, once after the podcast was released, the podcast had a lot of recordings of former sister-in-law of Bolsonaro telling all the crimes. And it was very important. So he actually wrote me a message threatening me, thinking probably that I wouldn't do anything. And then we made it public, that he sent that message, and I made a criminal complaint, a civil complaint. But before that, he had other behaviors like that. Once he actually said to me during a phone call something like, "You feel very powerful inside of this building that you work, but when you're in the street, you're just like someone else that can get shot in the head, because like Rio de Janeiro is a very violent city, and the president is working really hard against the violence." This is something he once like just said it out. And then other times saying inappropriate things about my looks and how he felt about my looks too, so sexual harassment too. And he was doing that. And then finally I made the criminal and the civil complaint, and a year after the first ruling in the civil case was that I was convicted for
You complained about his behavior, his harassment.
yeah, for the
case.
threat and the message.
Yeah.
But the judge in the first ruling decided that this was violating his privacy. We, like, just this week, 2 years ago, we took down this decision on the court, and he's still trying on the higher courts against this case, but now I'm not convicted anymore. But just to resume this, what I feel now from something that just happened like last year, because last year a group close to him, and part of this group is here in the US with Bolsonaro's son, fabricating narratives. For example, like last year they fabricated a conversation about me and someone who they don't share, they don't identify, but saying a very weird story about me talking to someone, saying things like I was part of I was a part of a scheme to make Bolsonaro go to jail. So it's just a very weird conversation. Everybody who knows me know that this is a fraud, and I actually had to go to the judiciary system also again to order for investigations on that, and that takes you time that you're not working. But it's all the same group, you know. I feel like, and now I accepted this, I will always be a target that they see that they have to take down, you know, in some way and somehow.
So they want to damage your credibility and your reputation entirely.
And your head, you know, they want to
mess around with your head. Yeah.
There is a psychological violence. I almost took like a time, you know, after this, because I thought the worst had gone, but this conversation was like from nothing. I was like taking a course, I was taking a fellowship. I wasn't even reporting when this was made. And from nowhere, I just woke up on Friday and there was like thousands and thousands of messages about this fabricated conversation. And I stayed like 3 months dealing with like thousands and thousands of messages, misogynist messages, people threatening, saying that they were seeing you in the street and things like that. And it took me a while again to take my life back to myself, you know.
Yeah. There's great psychic cost, as you must know, Siddarth, because you're editing an independent website that's reported critically on Modi and the BJP. Tell us what it's like and what you see, you know, what threats have you experienced and what you see are on the horizon. I mean, India had a free press before, very much like the United States. Free, willing, very independent, and then we see all of that being crushed entirely. How does that feel?
I mean, the proof of how dramatically things have changed in India is that if you went back to a year or two before Mr. Modi got elected and looked at the flavor of news coverage on television and in newspapers, you would find almost relentless criticism of the earlier government, the Manmohan Singh government, Congress-led alliance government. There were accusations of corruption, accusations of scams, accusations of the government not taking a case of gang rape in Delhi seriously enough, and that was what the Indian media was back in the day, just 10 years back. Today it's completely changed landscape. You know, I don't want to talk too much about nothing that I've experienced can be compared at all to, you know, the horrid stuff that we've just heard. But there are awful things happening in India in general to those journalists and media platforms that are standing up. And when I was preparing for this conversation, I thought, you know, if I were to draw up, you know, just pick 3 important sort of issues to highlight in terms of prominent threats existing or on the horizon, I would say the first one is, you there's lots of talk of lawfare, right? The use, AG referred to the use of civil suits as a form of harassment. And, that's been a constant in India for the last 30, 40 years. What's new under Modi is using criminal law. So to coin a new phrase, clawfare, right? So criminal law lawfare, right? So it basically, instead of filing only a civil damages suit, defamation, we have dozens of examples of reporters who have done stories that are critical of the police or point to some problem in government, administration. And these reporters get hit with, fairly serious criminal charges. So you could do a story on, you're reporting on hate speech, and the cops could end up filing a hate speech charge against you.
For writing that
story, right? So they'll say, well, all this is just made up, this never happened, and you are inflaming religious passions by writing this. And so we've had a few of those, reporters of The Wire have had a few of those, other people have also had, but this kind of weaponization of criminal law raises the game to a much more dangerous level, right? Because civil law, it's a waste of time, expenses, you get harassed, you get diverted from journalistic work. But in criminal law cases, there's always a threat of detention, right? And so and it's literally the random filing of criminal charges on the basis of a story that has a massive chilling effect, and particularly I would say for freelancers, right? So you're a freelance reporter in Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh, and you don't know whether if you do a story that's going to annoy some local district magistrate or police chief, will you end up facing criminal charges? And if you do so, will the news organization for which you've done that story, will they stand by you? Right. So this chilling effect that clawfare has is, I would say, problem number one. Number two is, digital media has emerged as a important part of the media landscape. Big media has collapsed, and digital media, is able to do a lot of independent reporting, and the government doesn't like it. So what Mr. Modi is trying to do is to introduce a raft of new regulations. You must register. You must, agree to comply with the so-called, official broadcast code, and all of this is aimed essentially at giving the government a say, ultimately, in deciding what is lawful, valid content and what is not. And the Indian Constitution never envisaged bureaucrats playing that kind of role, but Modi is pushing the law in that direction, essentially strengthening the takedown architecture. Right, so with digital publications, the problem is that the government has the right to demand that a certain story be deleted, and increasingly we're seeing this either through direct pressure on a website or on social media intermediaries. So Twitter, for example, Facebook, etc. So that's threat number two, and the third is, again, I saw echoes of it in what AG was saying, but I think we have it in a much more virulent and horrible form. Is the media, the big media, becoming a weapon against journalism, a weapon against democracy, a weapon against common sense. So you have this huge, virtually every single TV station in India echoes the government's talking points, often goes beyond what the government is saying, has become a vehicle for promoting hate. And when journalists are targeted for doing the work that they do, you will often find guys in this big media who will go on air to justify it. Yeah. So it's these kinds of threats that are particularly problematic. Lots of other smaller things, but I thought these are three things to that one should highlight.
That certainly resonates. Ida, I'm looking at you because you've been nodding your head. Does that resonate with your experience?
Yeah, it's so similar. It's incredible. So Morocco has always been really bad on press freedom. There has been a few years that were kind of good. Was when the new king ascended. I mean, he's not new anymore, but when we had one king died, the other king come to power, and one of the things he did was encourage free press for 2 years. And it's the complete opposite of what Trump is doing. It's like the way he wanted to start his reign was, I'm gonna actually encourage journalists to write about me and criticize me and so on. So when I first paid attention to journalism, I was in high school, and a Moroccan journalist who actually just spoke to my class 3 weeks ago went on a hunger strike. And I remember that really deeply impacting me. Someone is going on a hunger strike for the right to write, and that was very powerful. I was just 15 or 16, and that really stayed with me. And then anyway, I went to school here at Columbia, and when I moved back, very quickly, I saw, coming from the US, where I had some experience working as a journalist, going back to Morocco almost as a foreigner, rediscovering the rules, and at first doing some reporting and not being sure what the red lines are. As you said, it's very similar to India. You're not sure what's going to get you in trouble. And navigating this throughout the years, and I've seen between 2010 and today this dramatic decline in press freedom, where 14 years ago, you would have an op-ed in the Washington Post, and then the Moroccan journalist would get released. Today, they're put in solitary confinement for years. They're not prosecuted for what they write or they investigate. They're prosecuted for crimes that are completely made up by the state. So it's really hard to fight off these allegations. I personally, it's hard for me to put myself, at the same level of other Moroccan journalists, and that's because I've been writing for the New York Times all these years. Jason, who's here, I have to mention you. The security team has been so amazing in protecting me throughout the years and navigating threat and doing risk assessment and fighting doxing online and all that kind of harassment. So but I can speak of the experience of other colleagues who have been through hell. Their reputation were shattered, and that's very powerful because a journalist, and they will always tell you that they can stand up in court and defend their reporting. Defending these absurd charges or very humiliating charges is something completely different.
Yeah, so the intent is not just to silence, it's to humiliate you. Do you see the same thing, András, in Hungary? I mean, Hungary is this kind of similar to many of the countries we've discussed so far, right?
But first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's feels like being in a temple of journalism, the Pulitzer Hall. I mean, by the way, I don't know how many of you know that, but Joseph Pulitzer was born in Hungary. Yes. He's from Hungary. He's like many talented Hungarians. He had to leave his country to achieve success. Of course, now we have Viktor Orbán, who achieved world fame while being based in Hungary and doing his work in Hungary. And whenever I get this question, I always start by emphasizing that, I mean, Hungary is still a much better and safer place to do journalism than a lot of other countries. It's not Turkey, where journalists get jailed for their work, certainly not Russia or Mexico, where the journalists are in physical danger. But of course, if we compare Hungary how it was 15 years ago or 20 years ago, then that's a different story. And because you can still do independent journalism, there are still pockets of independence, but you have to pay a price for it. And the price that you have to pay can be, these are all coming from the fact that Orbán has built this really powerful propaganda machinery that you referred to before. That it's literally, it includes hundreds of outlets, digital, print, TV stations, almost all radio stations in the country. Literally all local newspapers, county papers in Hungary. And of course, while they were building this robust machine or even like a separate ecosystem, then a lot of journalists lost their jobs. So that's one price that you had to pay. Like I myself, when we started working on setting up Direct 36 10 years ago, because we had to leave our previous workplace, which came under pressure from the government, and we didn't want to stay there. So that's one thing. Then one of the purposes of this propaganda machinery is to attack anyone that the government thinks views as an enemy. And very often journalists are viewed as enemies. So it has become a routine that my colleagues and I and other independent journalists are attacked and labeled as foreign agents or traitors, and or just most recently, Orban gave a speech in March in which he called journalists and judges and civil society activists stink bugs that should be eliminated. So that was a new level. I think in that sense Trump was ahead of him because he already said those kind of things years ago. So you have to that's another price that you have to pay, that you have to work in this kind of environment. But there are even worse and more sinister things that can happen. Like a couple of years ago, we learned that 2 of my colleagues were put under surveillance with the Pegasus spyware. I'm still not over it that I wasn't considered important enough to be surveilled with that cyber weapon. And that's something that really, it wasn't a surprise, but it was still shocking that as it turned out, it was the Hungarian government or the secret services that deployed this military-grade cyber weapon against journalists, and apparently the reason was that they were doing their job. So yeah, it's not. I don't think we live in physical danger. There are legal threats. That's a little bit more complicated. We can go into that, but these are the circumstances more or less under which we operate.
So in many of these countries, you live in kind of like a normalized state of threat. You accept it as basically the price of doing business, that you'll be threatened legally, digitally, they'll mess up with your mind, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you maintain that, how do you hold the line, and how do you fight these threats? And I think this is what I want the rest of the conversation more or less to focus on. And let's go one by one. You mentioned, András, about this separate media ecosystem in which the autocratic leader dominates, and what Steve Bannon would call, uses muscle velocity to drown the information space with government propaganda and with pro-government information. How do you fight that? Do we have examples for that has succeeded? I mean, clearly in Brazil, the fact that Bolsonaro eventually had to step down from power, is there something we can learn from that? Yes.
I think now I'm on the board of our investigative journalism association, Abrage. And this is something we discuss a lot, like AJ talked about this. We don't have a playbook for this, how to face these threats, even the threats, the psychological damage to us, to our families. And something we did on CLEAP, on our investigations on CLEAP, is that when we are preparing, when we are discussing the story, how to do that, we created 2 committees, one ethic committee inside of the group, and to discuss protocols for ethics on reporting, but also a committee for safety. 3 people that are called in any situation that any reporter feel that need anything. And after that, you discuss any case, whatever is the situation, you discuss the case. This is something that we're starting to see how this works, and it's important. But Something I didn't said when I told a few things that happened to me is that this is a behavior that other women journalists face. This is something not just to me. I know some people here have heard about Patricia Campos Melo. She also faced some of these too, but there are many other ones. And Patricia and me, and she actually advised me about this because my threats started after hers, to take them to justice. This is something we don't do. Journalists don't suing them.
Yeah.
And this is something really difficult for the companies. The companies doesn't want to see journalists suing sources. Because at some point he was a source, like the lawyer was a source to me, to other reporters. And this is something that you see as a problem for other reporters too. I got a lot of like empathy from many colleagues, but this is something also, the reporting on this, the reporting on your case. Like, I feel personally attacked every time someone writes, the journalist said that the conversation is fake, is fabricated. This is like, I feel personally attacked. I'm a human rights reporter. I became a journalist to work on human rights. I actually treat my sources with all of the best of me as a human being. So when they write about me, like it's on my flesh, you know? And it's been a journey to understand all of it. You have also, because I do national stories, but on the ground, on countryside, in a country like Brazil, like on small cities, on the border, these get in another proportion as risks, and the psychological damage to the families too. So we do have a lot of killings on this. We don't have for national press. We are threatened, but we don't have national killings on journalists usually. But on the countryside, we have a lot. And we need to think about this. Suing, we have to discuss. And this is something we're starting to do. And there are some, when you won, is something important. Because after, it seems like you need a judge to say that, no, she's right.
If you can trust the courts.
Yeah, and the court many times, the truth, even for the court, sometimes doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what happened, really. Sometimes there are injustice on the system.
Yeah. So fighting back by suing, and also the other important thing I think you said was that it's important to have journalist organizations working together.
Preparing during the investigation. You have to discuss more and more during the investigation before. Try to prepare for what is going to come. You're not going to prepare for everything. Like me, myself, we are breaking a very important story in 3 weeks, and I know our lives are going to be hell, like, I know. But we're trying to do everything we can to prepare ourselves
So
for
preparing in advance, not after the story is published. Those are very good points. Siddarth, I'd like to ask you, I mean, AG talked about the US being a 250-year-old democracy, but India has been a stable democracy more or less since independence. Did you ever imagine that Modi could actually crush this long tradition of a free press and democracy in India? And how does the press react to that? I mean, I think here we're sort of still in a state of shock that this thing is happening. Did you expect this to happen, given his background and all of that? And what do you do when you're still trying to figure out, you know, what is the end game here? How do you report on something that is still, you know, just happening before your very eyes? Yeah.
Look, I mean, me and my colleagues founded The Wire in 2015. The work on it actually began in 2014 before Modi got elected. But we could see the writing on the wall. Modi is getting elected. We could see, and we were people, me and my two colleagues, we came out of big media. I was at The Hindu, my colleague Venu was at Financial Express, Siddarth Varadarajan worked at DNA, and so we were in big papers for years. And we could see that the Indian media proprietor was the weak underbelly of press freedom. That given the slightest pressure from the top, from the government, they would buckle. And many of them have business interests that they want to protect and which are vulnerable to government regulations changing or a little bit of pressure here and there. Many of them saw an opportunity to profit, knowing the orientation of the government. So frankly, what's happened over the last 10 years has not come as a surprise to me. We started The Wire on the assumption that that was going to happen, and that India would need a vibrant, independent media space. And what surprised me or pleased me actually is that we aren't alone. So we actually have a vibrant digital media ecosystem. We and some other colleagues in different media platforms met about a year and a half, 2 years ago to say what can we do as an industry. And we actually set up something called the DigiPub Foundation. So this is an industry-wide body now with more than 100 members. Websites, essentially digital platforms across the country in different languages that are doing good, vital work. All of them are financially constrained. All of them face the danger of lawfare, etc. And they're handling that kind of pressure. But the work is going on. So I think the fact that we survive and thrive, The Wire, others also, and we're doing the kind of work that we do, we break stories every week that big media avoids, is proof that resistance is possible. And resistance has to take many different forms, right? The first and most important form is that there has to be internal resolve, that you cannot capitulate. You cannot give in to any kind of pressure. You can't self-censor. You can't allow the government to taste blood by capitulating or doing something which you're going to regret later. And I think that internal resolve, that's where the game starts. And then you make every use of, we have you mentioned 75 years of democratic tradition and institutions. The fact is that Indian institutions are not half or even 1/10 as strong as they ought to be. They're much weaker than what you have in the US, and I dare say that in Trump too, there are genuine concerns as to whether these institutions are going to hold the line. But in India, if we speak of an independent judiciary, it's next to impossible for a journalist facing trumped up charges to get justice at the lower court. The lower the court, the greater the chance that the magistrate is likely to be influenced by or overawed by the executive. So you have to go up the legal food chain in order to get basic relief like bail, in the event of arrest. So, but I think it's important to use, as you said, Juliana, every single legal opportunity. When the government introduced new laws tightening control over digital media, we went to court. The Wire went to court. A couple of other platforms went to court. We managed to get the most odious parts of those provisions stayed by a high court. Pegasus, András mentioned Pegasus. My phone was, I've been Pegasus twice, and another colleague of mine too. We of course reported, we were part of the Pegasus project. We reported vigorously the extent to which Pegasus was used. But more importantly, you learn a lot about operational security. So how do you do journalism when your phone is completely compromised? Right? Every reporter worth his or her salt 9 years ago, 10 years ago had switched to WhatsApp and Signal, right? Instead of using regular cellular services, assuming that encrypted chats were safe. We knew after Pegasus that that's not the case. So how do you conduct your work in a post-Pegasus world?
What's the answer?
No, you find different, there are technological ways to do it, or you just resort to good old-fashioned meeting people, keeping your devices far away. And that work is going on. So finding new ways, staying top of your game as far as tradecraft goes, that's important. People have gone to court, and I think that solidarity. You mentioned press organizations. It's been great over the last 5 or 6 years. The revival of press clubs in India. Virtually every major city has a press club, and there's a greater appetite by these press clubs to speak out when journalists are threatened, and that's a new and very positive thing. So this is, I think, essentially resistance. I think global solidarity. Like we took a step 2 years ago when Modi was head of G20. And the government was making a huge song and dance about G20, India's presidency of the G20, and you have all these side meetings. There's the B20 for business people and W20 for G20 women. So we surreptitiously set up something called the M20. We said let editors and journalists from the G20 countries meet and discuss threats to press freedom. And we planned this below the radar because we knew the government would try to block it. At the end, we couldn't have a physical meeting because nobody would get visas for this, but we had a very nice online interaction with editors from G20 countries. And I think that affirmation of a shared threat that we face and a shared willingness to resist is something that's a very, very important part of this as we go forward.
Very good points. I mean, Ida, what about in the Middle East? We know the Middle East in all sorts of problems there. The whole playbook is actually playing out there, not in stages, but all at the same time. How have Middle Eastern journalists fought back in the midst of repressive governments, the war in Gaza and the West Bank? And
yeah, it's a really interesting question because for the past year and a half, it's the first time that all these signal groups I'm in with Middle Eastern reporters are not speaking about individual cases, but focusing on the killing of our colleagues in Gaza. And that has been such a huge scale that the notion of what's a risk and what's fear is really hard to define these days. I don't even know if I can say that I put myself at risk when I see dozens of my colleagues getting killed. So that's definitely something that's shifted. But one thing that I can say is different country to country. For example, we just had in the last couple of days a lot of activists and journalists getting sentenced in Tunisia. In Morocco, there's no independent journalists left, not even one. They're all in exile or in jail. In Egypt, it's very similar. Some outlets are still able to do interesting work, but they navigate this very, very complicated territory. So it's really grim. But what is amazing about this group of journalists is that we all know each other. We all support each other. There's a lot of solidarity, reporting on each other when someone gets arrested in another country and being in touch and so on. One of the things I did notice when the AP got banned or semi-banned from the press briefing room is that there was an uprising. I have a feeling if that had happened to us, we would have all boycotted the briefing room for sure. I'm hearing from friends in DC that there's negotiations about the seating charts, that they're changing the seats and so on. We don't do that. We kind of stick together because we know that competition doesn't matter. We're not trying to outscoop each other. We're not trying to do better stories than each other. We're just trying to keep everyone out of jail. So it's a very different ecosystem.
Do you see such solidarity in Hungary? I mean, Orban has been a very divisive figure, both in journalism and civil society, right? Yeah.
No, Hungarian journalists don't. They're not like that, but. I think when journalists are attacked, there is a temptation to fight back and engage in a direct fight with the politicians or the propagandists. And I always tell my colleagues that we shouldn't do that. I don't think it's the right approach because. Even if it's very tempting, sometimes I think that we journalists are really strange creatures because we both enjoy being a victim and a hero at the same time. But but the thing is that if you engage directly in a fight on social media or on whatever platform, then it will be very easy to be, that you are going to be viewed as an opposition, and it's easy to lose your, I think, or damage your credibility as well. So I think instead of turning towards the politician, I think it's much better to turn towards your audience, to the public, and explain to them what's happening. And we can tell them that, listen, we are under attack because of you, because these guys don't want you to hear these stories about corruption, about the problems in public services, the economy, whatever. So it's I know it sounds like a small difference, but I think actually it's a big difference in terms of how to deal with these situations. And to explain why I think this is, I've been thinking quite a lot about two questions. Why is this happening, and why is this happening now, and not only in Hungary but in almost everywhere? And even in this country, you had Richard Nixon, his vice president's bureau. I knew they hated the press. They wanted to crush the press, and they couldn't succeed. And I think why this current administration and Trump and his people are more successful is because, of course, there were enormous technological changes in the media environment, and whether we like it or not, but our relative power is, or our position is so much weaker than it was, because we don't control the flow of information. We are not gatekeepers anymore, at least to not the same extent as it was as we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I think they see an opportunity. They see that we are weaker financially. Of course, there are trust issues. I think so. I think they smell blood, so they want to crush us. And if we think about how we can get out of this, that's the second question I've been thinking. Is we are not going to change the minds of the politicians. Obviously, I don't think we are going to be able to change the technological environment. The tech firms are, I think, made it clear that they are not really interested in helping traditional journalism. So the only other stakeholder is the public, is the audience. They are going to be the only ones who can be allies in this struggle. So whenever we made a documentary about the Orban family's businesses and how they got so rich thanks to state and government funding. And even before the film came out, the government's propaganda machine started a campaign against us, and they came up with this really crazy accusation that this film was made as a part of a Ukrainian intelligence operation. It was just absolutely false, and such a blatant lie. And we responded, but again, we went to our audience, and we went to our readers and viewers, and we told them that, listen, first of all, this is a lie. Second, they are doing this because they are afraid of this film. They don't want you to see this film, and that's why this is happening. That's why this attack is happening. We also said that nobody should be afraid of the truth. This film is based on facts. It's and actually, the government even stopped these spreading these lies, because they understood that actually they were just creating more hype around the film, for which we were grateful.
Let's talk about that for a moment. When you talk about the audience or the public that you serve, as we've seen in many countries, populist leaders have following, and a very fanatic following. And they have succeeded in portraying the press as purveyors of fake news, or in India, I think they use the word prostitutes. or just have profits rather than the public service in mind. How do you maintain your credibility when the audience itself believes that the media is a tool of liberal elites or just wants to make money? How do you counter those narratives? Is it enough to produce good reporting? Is it enough to be transparent about your sources and your methods?
Yeah, probably not enough. I think we have to discuss more and more the way we tell the stories. How do we reach people? What's the best way in presenting each story? So there are stories that you can tell on a podcast that will reach people in a way you're not able to reach them on text. And I know that because, like, on my podcast, part of the content was already in stories that I wrote before, but when I actually reunited everything and with all the recordings that I, after like 2 years working on that, got it. And I know this was like once in a lifetime thing, that all the planets were aligned and all the recordings that I actually got for that project. And people could actually hear them telling the story. It wasn't just me, it was me telling, but they were hearing those people talking about the crimes they were committing. So this was powerful. People talk about that. People talk about that specific audio, but this was that story. After that, I wrote a book, and I told on the book things I did not have recordings, but that I thought they were important, more behind the scenes stories, and I reached more people with that. So I do believe we have a very important work in investigating and don't getting too much on hard news, and talking more and more the way we present this to people, and creating other ways to talk and present our stories in different formats.
Siddarth, is it enough to be transparent about your reporting?
No, I think transparency is important. About reporting, of course, about funding and financing. But one of the problems with a political system like India's, which is first past the post, is that it presents an exaggerated sense of the political support that the Prime Minister has. Mr. Modi at his peak had 60% of the seats in Parliament. But at the height of his electoral power, he never had, in terms of vote percentage or vote share, he never crossed 44%. In other words, the majority of Indians who vote are actually voting for candidates who are not with Modi, right? I'm not questioning the electoral system is what it is. Yeah. We live with it. But the reason I raise this is because if you want a sense of where the public stands, voting data itself tells you that there is a plurality of Indians, majority of Indians do not support Mr. Modi. And I would say that there is today actually a crisis in terms of the messaging of the government. We see a greater desperation in what they say in their speeches. I mean, a very good sort of bellwether is when Mr. Modi, who's otherwise very guarded, his rhetoric as Prime Minister is much less shrill than Trump. But there are times at elections, the last general election, for example, where Mr. Modi made more than 100 speeches where he directly attacked Muslims. And we saw that as a sign of him recognizing that government propaganda, with all the big media echoing it, was not having the desired effect on public opinion. And instead, folks like digital media, not just us, lots of YouTubers with millions of views, not all of it very professionally done, not all of it necessarily very reliable, but giving an alternative perspective that people were watching in millions. So we had this YouTube numbers don't lie. I'm sure the Russians or somebody has figured out a way to game it. But as far as I know, Mr. Modi, he would give an interview, and you could see the total number of views would be maybe 300,000, 400,000. And a criticism of what he says in that interview by some YouTuber would get more than 1 million views. So if you look at the data, the publicly verifiable data, you can see that digital media, independent voices are reaching a large body of public opinion and are influencing people, which is why precisely he wants to change the rules of the game to make sure that it becomes harder for digital content to be made accessible.
You're saying you just keep going and eventually you'll make a dent.
We make a dent because at the end of the day, right, this is not about us, right? I mean, press freedom is a derivative. It's about democracy functioning. And I think people recognize that.
And that the shelf life of these autocrats is kind of limited. Yeah, we just don't know how long to go. It's been very long in Hungary, for example, right? And the end is nowhere in sight.
Actually, now Orban is the weakest. He's been for 15 years, and because of the economy is not going well, and the story that his propaganda machine is telling is so detached from reality that people are experiencing, and there is also a pretty strong new opposition party, opposition leader. So, but we have elections from a year from now, so a lot can happen in between. But to answer your question about the what we can do to grow our audience and have a bigger impact. I mean, I have a pretty simplistic view about this because, I mean, again, what I can see that there is this, lot of pollution in our information environment. It's very toxic. It's full of disinformation, but I cannot really control this. It's out of my reach. So the only way to cut through that noise for me is to tell a powerful story. So whenever and that's why I'm always telling my colleagues, if if you're frustrated because you think that your stories are not reaching the audience, the people, then it means that your story is not strong enough. So the answer is more reporting. Almost always, I think it's in that way. Our profession is pretty simple. Like you need to do more reporting. You need to have stronger stories.
Yeah. So I was talking to this Egyptian journalist, Lina Atala. I'm sure you know her.
She's a good friend.
And Egypt is in a terrible state, but they just keep on going without really no impact in their reporting. I mean, how?
It's interesting you mentioned Lina. That I just saw her a week ago, and one of the conversations we had is that the journalism she's able to do in Egypt, we actually can't do in Morocco. Even though Egypt cracks down more, it's very strange. It's like each country is so different and strange in the way it functions. So she's still able to put out these amazing investigations. I'll give you a very simple story. I did a profile on an Egyptian prisoner who was smuggling out pieces of writing in his laundry and that Lina's website was publishing. okay, so in Morocco, when you're a journalist in prison, they actually, when you give your laundry to your family, they unpack everything, they take pictures of everything, they search everything, so you wouldn't even be able to get your writing out. So it's these things where each country functions differently. And what you said about no impact, I do ultimately believe that it's good to have these stories exist and be out there. You mentioned you were part of the Pegasus project with Forbidden Stories. I assume you have organizations that like Forbidden Stories who pick up these investigations. They've done so in Morocco on land grabbing by the monarchy and these complicated business investigations where there's an ecosystem out there that amplifies these stories, and I think it's good that some journalists kind of start it, maybe sometimes at the risk of their freedom or their safety, but then I think the bigger the consortium of journalists, the bigger, it's hard to attack if there's a lot of you doing a story.
So like cross-border collaboration, doing the same stories, protecting each other just because of the sheer number and scale of the...
I think when Forbidden Stories or Lighthouse Reports comes out with a story with 200 contributors, it's even in Morocco, there was the desert dump story last year, and when I did that story a few years ago, I get so much harassment. And then when Lighthouse did it with a consortium of journalists around the Mediterranean, it was kind of, they didn't pay attention to who contributed from Morocco because you have a big number.
You kind of have safety in numbers if you do similar stories or the same story all together and publish all at the same time. I mean, we've had experiences of these collaborations for the last 10 years, since the Panama Papers were published in 2016. Let's talk about, before I open up to questions, let's talk about what support would you need out in the field from your own community as well as from outside. What would be the most helpful in sustaining this kind of independent reporting?
I mean, I personally would really like to see, all these media owners, billionaires, corporate executives, European Union leaders, who had been preaching about press freedom for long, when it was easy, when it was not in danger, to come forward and stand up for those values. So, I mean, I know it's kind of wishful thinking, but I know that you can experience it here as well in this. I mean, in this country, that we see media owners, corporations bending their knees. So, but the good news is that you will find allies and supporters elsewhere, like we did in Hungary.
Yeah, thank you.
Look, I think solidarity is essential. Trans-border solidarity is fantastic. Every country has different laws and rules. So that, for example, the Indian media, Indian laws don't allow financial support from outside. And whereas it may, in Hungary, it may be possible, in Brazil, it may be possible. I think in those countries where independent media is able to legally tap into donations, philanthropic especially, or media support from abroad, I think that should be encouraged. But I think more importantly, a willingness to speak out, to document, and write about threats to press freedom is essential. The Modi government is contemptuous of the foreign press and is very hostile towards it. They've made it very difficult for foreign reporters to get visas, for example. But when stories do appear, they take them seriously. And they will get very upset, and it has an impact. So stories that document, violations of press freedom in India, plus other human rights violations, are essential. But I think when media in one country stands up for media in another, I think it's and when media as a collective finds a way to, for example, I know this changes the topic slightly, but in the US, you have foreign students who are under threat across different campuses. Can you imagine the difference it would make if 10 Ivy Leagues or the top 20 universities, instead of disowning these kids, right, were to come together and say, look, we are going to come up with a joint strategy so that these various infractions on which foreign students have been kicked out on the eve of their graduation can be stopped. It will make a huge difference, right? So collective action by stakeholders, and here I think now the stakeholder is global, because as we have seen, Hungary, Brazil, Morocco, and West Asia, or North Africa, India, the US, we're all in the same boat. I mean, when I was looking at press freedom in different countries, the use of national security to threaten journalists with imprisonment it didn't necessarily start, but we saw the first conviction in Finland, of all places, where a Finnish editor who published a story about the Finnish Secret Service. I didn't even know there was a Finnish Secret Service. and they threw the book at her, and she got convicted. Yeah. And many people and I raised this at a media event in Vienna, literally 2 years after it happened, and many European editors didn't even know about it. Right, so we need to be aware of what is happening to our colleagues across the world and be willing to speak up. Right. And I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of difference on the collaborative work and publishing together, but sometimes this is not possible. Sometimes you're doing a story that's your story. For example, I'm preparing a new project for next year. We're gonna have elections, and the biggest story in the country is the intent of the coup d'etat in the election of 2022. And from what I see, we were talking just now about how do we reach people, and this is something I feel from my country. Our people don't understand the real threat we were all facing of. Now we got many documents, and the rulings are starting in the Supreme Court, and we got access to many things, and we know how violent all of that was. So, for example, for this that I'm starting to work on, I talked to because I work with CLIP, but I also work with a Brazilian organization. It's called ICL Notícias. It's a new one. I talked to them. I talked to the editors of my book, and everybody to put them on the same page and say, okay, I'll start that, and I have the sources, I will have the documents, and I can organize this story in a very interesting way to understand the story, not like all these like thousands and thousands and thousands of pages and audios we heard. But are we going to be together? Because I don't know what's going to happen. One thing we know is that for the podcast, for the other book, I was always working to don't make any mistakes that could put me on danger, that they would use that against me, and I didn't do. So when they didn't have a mistake, a problem on the stories, they invented anyway. So now we will discuss during the production of all of these, and face each time on each problem. And for that, I arranged like this with my employers. I discussed this with like my lawyers, because I have I lost the count, but sort of 10 working in different cases. And even with my family, I put everybody in the same page. Let's do this together, because we have to. I feel that I don't want to be any kind of Wonder Woman. You know, I'm right, not. Right. We have to be responsible on what we're doing.
Yeah. So Ida, I mean, I'm wondering actually whether, the institutions we had built since, say, the 1990s to protect a free press around the world, which means organizations that monitor press freedom violations, pro bono law firms that will help journalists, security experts that will come to our... I wonder whether that is enough.
I mean, it's sometimes very helpful, but it's never enough, unfortunately. I mean, these press freedom watchdogs do a lot, but they're also overwhelmed. I think we also need to... One of the lessons I've learned from Morocco, we talked about it a little bit this week, is like now in the US, some of the things you can learn from us is prepare, for example, a press plan. If you get arrested, who gets to speak for you? Because trust me, these kind of the things that get very confusing and complicated. You need to have an emergency plan. You need to prepare in advance. And I think there's some lessons to be learned from each other. I do think these organizations do a lot. I know so many journalists who were released thanks to these press freedom watchdogs, and it's really great, but it's never enough, unfortunately. And I mean, for me, it's very hard to be optimistic because in all the spaces I'm in, it's just, I don't see things getting better, and they haven't.
It's your turn to ask questions. I think, Gypsy, you're here. Do you want to say something? Gypsy is head of communications for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Maybe you should respond to that observation. Are we doing enough?
And donate to CPJ.
I appreciate that. I'm Gypsy Guillen-Kaiser. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I actually... I think we've heard a lot of wisdom from you, but I do have two questions that touch on things that we have been working on. One of them is the issue of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, we've seen that in the issue on the issue of aid, particularly, not in terms of the actual funding, but as USAID assistance was pulled, there was a smear campaign that happened against journalists that were receiving some of that funding, news organizations that were receiving some of that funding, painting them as corrupt and not independent. And the US is retreating in terms of human rights defense globally, which affects some of our ability to also leverage that influence. And so I'd love to hear from you how you see the US sort of foreign policy, human rights support retreat, not in terms of funding, but in terms of values-based leadership, how you see that affecting press freedom from your perspective. And then the other question that I had was actually for Juliana. There is a large and robust evangelical media in Brazil, which has political influence. And in the same way that the MAGA media, if you will, is starting to take space in the United States media landscape, and exerting some political influence. Do you see any parallels, and can you talk a bit about the role of evangelical media, if any, in delegitimizing journalists? I think we'd benefit from hearing more of your wisdom on those two things.
So the question about U.S. foreign policy, the fact that it's retreating from human rights, does that have an impact?
I mean, I personally would never take state money for my journalism, so it's hard for me to comment on that.
We had at Abrage, our association, myself was accused, and I never got any money from USAID. And Abrage was also, when this smear campaign started, we got weeks of this, me and Abrage. And for us, okay, we left. It was not one of the worst smear campaigns we faced, but in Brazil, I don't remember any group who actually had many problems on this case, but I know around Latin America, many people were attacked for this. And for your second question, they don't have a very important role as evangelical press in Brazil, but we have problems with their leaders against us and against especially reporting on women and women's rights. This I can say, like for sure, there are many harassment against women, especially journalist women who are reporting on abortion. We have one of the worst laws on abortion in the world. In Brazil, it's not legal. You only can do an abortion if you are violated or the child has no brain, or even if the woman is on danger of her life. This is only 3 options. And they wanted to take this out too. They are working on a lot on Congress to take only these 3 options. And making smear campaigns against journalists and doctors who does the procedures. And they are growing, but not as press, you know. I don't see them very organized yet.
If I can just answer the first part of Gypsy's question, I think it's a great question. Apart from USAID, or prior to Trump making USAID an issue, Soros funding was the big way to smear people. And, you know, in India, the right wing has tried this. That, oh, these guys are all Soros funded. It's just water. It has zero public impact, and even the USAID propaganda hasn't had any impact at all. Even though there was this funny, very bizarre revelation that Doge made, that USAID had given money for voter awareness in India, and the BJP immediately pounced on the Congress and said, "Look, you guys have taken money," and then Trump made a statement where he said, "We gave 40 million for voter awareness in India to my friend Modi." And the BJP immediately dropped the whole thing. It turned out that the money was actually given to somebody in Bangladesh, not even India. So it's total, you know, craziness. But, you know, the foreign policy part is important. I think that the fact that press freedom, look, the US has always had a very contingent approach, right, towards press freedom. So they're never particularly bothered about press freedom in countries that are closely allied to them. We've never heard Blinken or the current Lord speak about violation of press freedom in Gaza. So it's very contingent. But insofar as the State Department may make noises about this, it was something that annoyed and irritated, you know, Modi or anybody else, right? So that's going to stop. But more importantly, my fear is that with violations of press freedom now being real and present danger in the US, the amount of space that the US media may have to chronicle the troubles of people around the world may diminish, right? Because they're busy fighting their own fight now. So that's my concern.
Yes, Deep.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is in the spirit of promoting dialogue between journalists across challenged democracies. If there is one thing that from your experiences and the lessons that you have learned, you would like US-based media to take away, and one thing that they should be doing different from business as usual, what would it be? And the second part to that is, what is one thing that US legacy media owes to the rest of the world? Yeah.
Anyone wants to take that question? What can US media do to...
This is so difficult, but because for our experience, like our school of journalism is very close to the American school on the way we report and on our standards. But one thing we are discussing more and more and more, and I'm not saying that should be different. I think this is a discussion we have to do, a discussion on how we see and treat like impartial, the concept, fairness, and how to present the sides of story. It's okay to, of course, present all the sides of the story, but it's not always fair or even impartial, present in the same size or the same way. These are things to discuss, you know, and to evolve in journalism. And this is something we faced a lot covering Bolsonaro, for example. For a very long time, and on the press, we know, because I can't be, I always criticize that, but many colleagues were afraid, or I don't know, not afraid. They were like, they didn't want to say the president was lying. And he was lying. This was not a mistake. Bolsonaro made a mistake about, no, he was lying. He was lying about this, he was lying about that. He was lying all the time about almost everything. So you have to say, because he had the intent, he knew what was the truth. So this was something we discussed a lot, and for a very, very long time, they used it to say mistake. I think we only changed it as like the press in general during the pandemic, when things got about science.
So my fear is that, to answer, if I can use my moderator prerogative, I think what is happening in the US is being used by other countries, populists and autocrats in other countries, to say, hey, look, the US, they have the First Amendment, but look at what the Trump government is getting away with. And that it almost gives permission to do the same kinds of things elsewhere. And so I think US journalists owe it to the rest of the world to fight back so that this does not become an example to the rest of the world. Yeah.
Sheila, I'd like to add to that. I've seen a shift when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, and there was no reaction, barely any reaction or consequences. And there was a moment I really saw a shift, at least in Morocco. It was like, oh yeah,
it's okay to do this.
Yeah.
I can try to put some optimistic spin on this, but when I saw the anxiety and fear from American journalists after Trump returned to power, and then I was like, I told some of them that I'm happy because finally we got some powerful allies in this fight for these problems that we are facing in Hungary.
We are all in the same boat. Yeah.
Yes, and then we have a new ally that is really resourceful, innovative, and powerful. So I think most of the challenges that we've talked about. I mean, there are country-specific things, but pretty universal. So, and I really believe that if we find our place in this new emerging, whatever it is, this political media complex, and then that will be the solution for most of our problems, I think.
Yeah, two points in response to your question. I think the first thing that I'd like to say is that, and this I can say, given my experience of what's happened in India over the last 10 years, that if you think, and this is advice to American media, if you think that appeasement and being conciliatory on first principles is going to buy you peace. And by the way, this is not just advice to the US media, but to US universities. and one particular university where I study, so I speak with some authority and some sense of belonging. That if you think you think you can appease your way out of this, you're going to find you're in a very, very bad place, because Trump and people like Trump are going to climb all over you. And the demands are just going to mount, and things will just get much worse, right? So the Jeff Bezoses of the world, who say that we want to retool our op-ed page to only talk about freedom of speech, but try publishing a piece about freedom of the press or human rights or free speech when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Good luck. Right, so that kind of approach that is not good, is going to make things much worse. And the second thing I wanted to say was, there was a question in the first session, and this is advice, or this is a perspective, not I'm not saying this as somebody with experience of Indian media, because Indian media is very bad on this question as well. But if the death toll of journalists, I think it was your question, if it had happened in Russia, Ukraine, what Israel has done in Palestine, there's no question about the kind of coverage it would have had and the kind of outrage it would have triggered in the US and around the world. So I would like to see, just I'm saying as a reader, a little bit more balance. I think that would help. But you know, the first point that if you conciliate with Trump, things are going to get much worse. You have to fight and resist.
So really running out of time. Can we hear both questions and then we'll answer them both together? Yes.
Thank you so much for this panel. It's a bit of a specific question, so feel free to make it wider if it takes too long to reply. But one of the things, I'm a student here, and one of the things that I'm seeing is also that we have an issue of access to institutions, not necessarily only government institutions, but also institutions like this university, in the sense that as press, we're met with very sort of prepackaged statements. And one of the things that I see colleagues of mine doing here is sort of try to read through the language to make sense of what could hide behind the words when we have very little information from the source that we need to reference, like we need to attribute to. I was wondering if this is an issue that you've seen. I'm curious about Hungary, I'm curious about India specifically. I wonder how it works in contexts like Morocco.
How you get around no
like,
access to
yeah,
official
so
sources.
Whether you rely on sourcing that is on the inside of these institutions, when do you even reference official statements by institutions, and whether it's any good at all to kind of read through the language, because I feel like maybe journalists that have been trained in this tradition are used to a level of access that we probably will not see once we go out in the field.
Thank you. Sasha, yeah.
Hi, thank you all for sharing your experiences. My question is, in your countries, if you found that there were organizations of professional journalists or even informal networks of journalists that emerged to defend press freedoms that were under attack, and if any groups like that were effective in defending press freedoms.
All right. Yeah,
I can answer.
Okay, the second question first.
Question first. So in Morocco, the Union of Journalists are all informants, but we do have our own informal. Like we kind of know each other. We vouch for each other. We have to be careful because sometimes you think someone is your friend, and then you find out they've been spying on you. So you kind of have to always be careful, but after some years, you kind of know who your people are, and we try to be in touch all the time. The kind of risk assessment you would do with your newsroom, we do with each other. I just got right now a text from a friend who was crossing a border. Just let me know he crossed the border safely. So you have these things where you kind of have to watch each other's backs. I don't know if you...
Informal networks, yeah.
We have Abrage, for example, our association for investigative journalism. We have more than 20 years working exactly on that. The organization was created after one of best investigative reporters was murdered in Rio, and the Committee for Protection of Journalists is a very important ally. It was very important for me, from my cases, and Reporters Without Borders. But we actually try to work and talk together. For example, when I was coming here, like I let them know, because I was worried about two things: about getting in, because I know all the problems on the immigration, and we had a few colleagues who had problems in the past weeks, but also because they are here, right? I didn't even made it public. I know it was public by the university, but they are not very smart enough to look on the university and Instagram of the university. But I know that if I made it public on my social media or even on the news outlet that I work, that I was going to be here at this point, I don't know what they would do, you know. So it's not even public in Brazil that I'm here now. But I let them know before. And for the first question, we are answering.
Yes, for the first question is access. What do you do if you do not have access?
For all the time Bolsonaro was in presidency, the only statement we got from the press secretary was, there is no comment, there is no comment, there is no comment. And this is something...
It's more than we ever get from our government.
Yeah. So it is... you need all kinds of sources, like human beings and documents. You have to be diverse. You need all of them. And sometimes, once I heard a story about how was made how a very important story was made, and the journalist stayed like just outside of the building, trying to confirm that someone was dismissed from a very important job. And he started talking to the people who were cleaning, you know, like, yes. And they were sad. They were sad because I don't remember what job was, but that person was dismissed. They were crying. And why are you crying? And then the story came out.
So being more creative and imaginative about where to find sources.
Yeah, talk to everybody.
And actually very controlled governments, they leak a lot because there's so many factions within that.
Right. Yeah. Like when you're at a press conference, you're not really paying attention to the person behind the podium because they're probably just saying whatever statement they have to say. But then there's someone who's going to be sitting, standing in the back that you can chit-chat and maybe get more interesting information
I think we need to end this conversation because we're way past our time. I'm sorry about that.
Can I have 20 seconds just to close?
20 seconds.
20 seconds.
I'm timing.
Yeah. So we have a reasonable network of journalist organizations in India. In answer to your question about solidarity, and it's effective. Lack of access is not an issue because, like in Hungary, the government does not give answers, and the Prime Minister, this is the first time we have a Prime Minister who doesn't even have an official spokesperson in his office. So there's no place to put questions, let alone get answers. And that's a blessing, quite frankly. Of course, you know, this means you have to be extra careful because you're never going to get a comment. But often access is simply euphemism for the government planting stories. And thank God that doesn't happen with folks like us.
Right. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for such an inspiring panel about fighting back. And we look forward to following your work. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. We're ready for our next conversation.
So thank you. We have a concluding conversation, which is a kind of encapsulation, which will be between Bruce Brown, who is president of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and Azmat Khan, who is our own, very own Katie Birch Professor of Journalism and the director of the Simon Lee Center for Global Journalism here. So thank you, Azmat, and thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Jelani. Can you all hear me? No? How about now? Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel earlier. We have a tough job because we have about 15 minutes in which we are supposed to say, you are supposed to say, I just get to prompt it, brilliant things that help us sort of summarize what we've heard and lessons that we can take home today. And so I wanted to start first with, I think, some of your broad points that you wanted to make in the wake of the incredible reporters we just heard from and the earlier conversation that set this all off.
Thank you, Azmat. I, of course, have been privileged to have the Reporters Committee call you a client.
Wait, I should say something.
Yes.
So I should say many of our students are very familiar with the Reporters Committee, not just because I am, you know, your years-long client and you guys have represented me in multiple lawsuits, but because I have scribbled the number of the Reporters Committee legal hotline with a Sharpie on the arms of countless students as they go out and about around campus reporting in the fear that they might get arrested. And so if you do not have the Reporters Committee hotline like memorized, come to me. I'm happy to write it on your arm. But our students are they're very familiar with your extraordinary work, and I am deeply indebted.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here with you. We are a legal services organization governed by a board of journalists, and our board chair, Steve Adler, is here in the audience, and our board member, Jennifer Sondag, is over there as well. And we're trying to sum up in 15 minutes, so I thought I would just hit a couple of points about the moment I think we're in. The first two, discouraging. The last one, maybe a little more encouraging. The Belgian writer George Simenon wrote a novel called The Train about a community in France that's preparing for the invasion of the German army. And they make meticulous plans how they will keep families together, how they'll make sure they have enough food, how those who are fighting in the resistance will be able to do what they hope to do to hold the German army back. And all of those plans crumble in a matter of hours. And I've been thinking about that novel quite a bit because at Reporters Committee, we went through a similar exercise that AG mentioned that the Times went through, where we kind of war gamed out where we thought the major threats would come from in the next administration, and it's a long list and it keeps you up at night. The one thing we did not envision was how quickly big law would crumble in the face of the Trump threats, and it's what made me think about that novel. So many of the firms that RCFP works with were suing for peace before they had even begun to fight. And it was extremely discouraging. We have 25 lawyers on staff. We have other law firms we work with. We have new law firms that are coming into the picture, which is encouraging. But I never thought I would see some of the law firms so quickly decide that they were not going to put up the fight.
What's motivating some of those newer law firms? Like, what is the sort of moving point for them to say, hey, we want to join this when we hadn't before?
Well, I think I'd like to believe that the desire from the associates bubbles up a little bit to the leadership of the firm. I mean, we've found through the years when we bring new firms into our pro bono work that a lot of the times it does come from the younger lawyers. They're coming out of law school, maybe they've had access to a First Amendment clinic, or they've done other clinical work at law school, and they get to the firms and they want to do that kind of work, and it does bubble up to firm leadership. And I think in some cases, if you look at what Munger, Tolles, and Olson has done in particular, not only have they been organizing amicus work, they've also been in court directly representing some of the law firms that have been targeted. And so we're encouraged that the ones who are coming in were shocked by the ones who exited so quickly. The second overarching point I wanted to make was that, as I mentioned to you, if the two of us were riffing about press freedom a couple of years ago, I might say to you, well, the FOIA's looking a little better in some cases. We're still nervous about reporters' privilege. I'm not so worried about New York Times versus Sullivan. I think that's going to hold. We would be talking about a system or making assumptions about a system in which rule of law was holding more broadly. And I think one thing that has not been yet mentioned here, although all the excellent conversation so far, is that it is impossible to divorce press freedom today from what's happening to rule of law in the country overall. And as a First Amendment lawyer, if I look at my colleagues who are doing immigration work, and so much heroic efforts in that area are taking place right now, or lawyers who are trying to get USAID funding reinstated, or lawyers who are working on behalf of federal government workers who've been pushed out of their jobs, and you see valid judicial orders not being acknowledged by the administration in those areas, you recognize that we're all in this together. And so in that sense, it's impossible to divorce the work that press freedom lawyers do, First Amendment lawyers, with the work that other lawyers are doing in other areas now. On a more optimistic note, I did want to mention that I think there has always been a magic to the judiciary in this country, and I remember that in the obituary for Anthony Lewis that was in the New York Times, towards the end of that piece, it's noted that he loved the journalists and he loved the lawyers who fought for the journalists, but he thought what was special in this country were the judges. And there have been some encouraging signs, even in very difficult, this very difficult moment. You have a judge in DC appointed by President Trump in his first term who gets the AP case, and he initially doesn't feel like he has enough information to grant the TRO, what lawyers would call the temporary restraining order, but then he sets a series of hearings, and the AP has a chance to put on its case, and they put on a very effective case, and lawyers take note. The journalist witnesses were what I think was particularly terrific in those hearings. The two AP journalists who testified really did a fantastic job, and he fines for the AP. And around the same time, a very important test case in the libel world was resolved in Mississippi, also at the trial court level, for Mississippi Today. And there you've got judges who are appointed, state court, a judge who was appointed by a Mississippi governor ruled against a former Mississippi governor, in finding that it was appropriate to dismiss that case. And I think that those are two very different examples, but they are recent, and I think they should give us all hope that if we believe in the courts and we think of the courts as a very important audience for us in this moment, that we can obtain positive outcomes. And the last one I was going to mention that I find encouraging too, the last example, it's not coming out of court, but twice now in recent years, there have been efforts in Florida to weaken state libel law as a path towards teeing up challenges to New York Times versus Sullivan. And in each year, organizations on the left and the right came together. I know solidarity was mentioned several times on the last panel, and organizations from the left and the right came together and defeated those efforts, even though they were supported by Governor DeSantis. And I think in this moment, it's also extremely important that advocates for press freedom, see ourselves, we're not partisans in any particular way. We are advocates for this work, and we should have advocates on the left, advocates on the right, and I think together, what Florida has shown is that we can protect freedom with a broad ideological coalition.
That is hopeful. I want to take it back to a little bit of a dark place. And
that's okay. I'm going to turn it light, though. But
okay, you do you. We are both here for a reason. So I want to walk through like a few of the sort of threats and get your perspective on, what their likelihood is, what we might see materialize based on conversations I've been having with people and some of the things that have come up. So one I hear repeatedly is challenges to the nonprofit status of news organizations, and also challenges, related to taxes with freelancers. Right. What is the likelihood of seeing that materialize for news organizations and young freelancers, or not even just young freelancers, but journalists who are increasingly made up of freelancers who do this work arduously, often without legal representation, often with these indemnity contracts, but also with the very strange, like I've been hearing from people who've had their taxes examined, freelance journalists who've had their taxes
right.
examined recently. What is the likelihood of things like that materializing in a more systematic way?
Well, Azmat, you're exactly right. There's a high degree of anxiety about this right now. And we at the Reporters Committee work very closely with a lot of nonprofit newsrooms. And we're fielding a lot of questions about 501c3 status, questions about the role of the IRS versus the role of the state AGs, if there's an investigation at that level. Tomorrow, in fact, I'm putting together in a phone call my law school friend Neil Katyal, who's a very, very well-known Supreme Court advocate who's been looking closely at this issue on behalf of universities, and I'm going to put him together on a call with nonprofit leaders in the journalism world, and there is a lot of anxiety about it, but again, it is very difficult to strip nonprofit status, and as we've heard on the other panels, it's not difficult to make you feel pain and have to defend an investigation, but to take nonprofit status away when you have not engaged in any overt political activity is very, very difficult. And you know, there's a appeals process through the IRS, and then you get to federal court. And I think you saw in the coverage of the threat against Harvard that there were many tax experts who weighed in and said, no, the likelihood of this happening is very remote. But there's anxiety, and in the nonprofit journalism world, the resources are very scarce. And so one of the things we have to do at RCFP is make more tax lawyers available, right, to people. And we're doing that. It's one of the things we're doing. And you know, earlier in one of the panels, there was a question from a freelancer about immigration. And I met just for a second with her, you know, after Dean Cobb and AG spoke, and I told her we're getting a lot of requests now for immigration help. And when I started the Reporters Committee 12 plus years ago, there wasn't a question we would get about immigration needs. And now we're trying to beef up in the immigration area as well. So we're preparing for these needs, and the capacity is not where I'd want it to be. I'm more nervous about immigration than I am about the 501c3 issues, though.
Okay. I also want to ask about, you know, I hear that there are some, especially some climate justice organizations and others who, you know, sort of say they're being queued up for material support to terrorism. And I want to understand what the likelihood is of that being applied in a climate in which, you know, journalists reporting on what's happening in Israel and Gaza, for example, has made some journalists be labeled pro-Hamas journalists in this way that's extraordinarily dangerous, that, you know, invokes, you know, issues of these sort of terrorism accusations. What is the likelihood that material support might be used against particular journalists, and what is also the likelihood that this, under the same provision, it's being used, for example, with students about who are, you know, accused of endangering the national security of the United States? What's the likelihood that that could be used against foreign journalists who are here in the United States reporting?
I'll take the material support question first. You know, that was a bill that was introduced in the last Congress, and you know, we didn't see a likelihood to passage. What it would do is enable the IRS to investigate and potentially strip protected nonprofit status from organizations that were deemed material support. It may come back in this Congress. I don't think it's likely that it passes. And we had questions at different convenings from reporters. And again, I thought it was more of a scare tactic than something that would be an effective strategy. I'm quite alarmed by the assertion of national security powers against the students. And I think that there are, unfortunately, broad powers that the government if successful, using them against students, they could very well then move on to other vulnerable groups. I think that this is another area where we need more collaboration between the First Amendment lawyers and the immigration lawyers, because the two areas are going to merge in a dangerous way. But again, you know, I have faith in the federal courts. I think the challenge in some of these immigration issues is that some of them will play out in non-Article III courts, and just so people understand, you know, there's a whole system of immigration courts in the country that are, you know, created by Congress, and they are not staffed with judges who have life tenure like judges in Article III courts. And immigration courts are an example of that. And so the immigration judges don't have the same life tenure and the same you know, protections to rule with their conscience the way that federal judges do. And so what you're seeing in some of these immigration cases is kind of a race to get to federal court so that you can get in front of an Article III judge. If you're an immigration court, it's just a much more difficult venue to be in. And then for all the journalists in the room, it's a much more difficult court to cover, because immigration courts don't have the same presumption of openness that Article III courts have.
Okay, and the last one for me is related to something that I think a lot of young students who are student journalists and reporting right now, whether that's, you know, about campus protest, whether that is, you know, on what's happening in the city, reverberations of this war, which is, you know, incredibly meaningful to young people. They are really watching this, and it's really stunning to me. I watch things like TikTok and I see kids talk about what a 2,000-pound bomb can do. I see kids describe what a Hellfire missile does, and this was not the case, you know, 3 years ago. Like, there's a much more literate, in some ways, public, and young people are extremely engaged on this issue. But there are a lot of younger journalists who are out covering these stories and have found themselves. So, for example, you know, there are student reporters who were in the encampment merely reporting and found themselves on some of these websites that accuse people of anti-Semitism, websites like Canary Mission, some of the same sites that have been used, for example, in the deportation, or have been cited, you know, as part of the campaigns that preceded efforts to deport Mahmoud Khalil or Mohsen Madawi and others. And they found themselves as, you know, essentially put on these websites. It may not be accusing them, it may not be like a material support charge or anything like that, but it is something that can have a really silencing effect on young reporters who, when you Google them, if that's one of the first things that come up, can radically alter their career. What advice would you give to them, and who would you point them to go to in this landscape where, you know, Reporters Committee is defending reporters, and especially thinking through young reporters?
Right. Well, I still want you with that number memorized for the RCFP hotline and sending them to us. We've gotten involved in some of the campus journalism issues. The Student Press Law Center, of course, does some of that work too. But I spent some time working with Dylan Gohill at Stanford, who was the reporter who was arrested when the president's office was occupied. And it took a while, but the university, you know, came around, and charges against him were dismissed. The kind of matter you're describing, I want those young journalists calling us, because we need to know what's happening in the field. And depending upon what they need, you know, it could be that we would refer them to CPJ, you know, we might refer them to, you know, Penn or IWMF, some other organizations that do more direct work in that area. We have yet to find an effective legal strategy to help people in that situation. I know Juliana mentioned that some journalists in Brazil, you know, are fighting back with their own lawsuits, and it's kind of ingrained in the DNA of the Reporters Committee that we just don't want more libel litigation in the country. So we've not gotten behind those kind of countersuits, and we're unlikely to. But I think there are some of our peer organizations have toolkits and a playbook for young journalists who find themselves in those situations.
Thank you so much. I mark his words. He said you can come to him for support. So definitely take that hotline.
It is a true 24/7 hotline. And when other organizations come to us, they say, well, tell us how you set it up. Is it kind of like a 9 to 5 thing? And I said, well, we've learned through the years when you work for journalists, things don't happen on a 9 to 5 basis. And so we have coverage at night, we have coverage over the weekends, and we're a little like one of those, television shows with the young doctors. I mean, each of our fellows takes nights and they take weekends, and it truly is a number you can call and you will hear back from someone, within a day or so at least. So please use it.
Well, there's we had so many topics to
Yeah,
cover
I know.
today. I'm really grateful for you and for all of our speakers before you for illuminating these issues. And I just wanted to add one last thing. As a war correspondent, I just wanted to note, on the questions we heard from students about media coverage, that historically speaking, looking at past war and media coverage, there have been lessons that have been learned in the years since, right? Things that weren't acknowledged in real time that might come out. And what I would encourage you to do as student journalists is to really dig in with reporting to look at this, to bring that heft, to bring that gravity, the gravitas that you bring when you think about accountability journalism, to examining what those lessons might be. And I just wanted to say thank you for your courage, for your candor, and for all of our speakers who've been so thoughtful, and to AG and others who've really brought to light so many of these issues. So thank you so much.
So I just have a couple of things to say as we wrap up. I want to thank you all for spending this afternoon with us. I certainly want to thank everyone from Columbia Journalism School who worked really hard to make this happen. I want to thank everyone from the New York Times as well who worked to make this happen, and particularly to thank the Times as our partner in this event. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our faculty who participated. And I want to say just two quick things. One is that, we institutionally were made for this moment. When we think about all the things that we do, the reasons that we got into this profession, the work, the stories that we've covered, it was meant because we believe we hold certain values. And those values are being challenged now in this country in ways that we're not accustomed to. But the path of this country has been paved by people who looked at moments like this one and stepped up to the challenge. And so Columbia Journalism School is committed to continuing to fight to make sure that the First Amendment is respected and that freedom of the press endures. The other is that if you are watching on the live stream and you are an admitted student who is considering whether or not this is the place for you, these are the conversations that we have ahead of our May 1st commitment deadline. And so we invite you to specifically join in, and this is expect more of the same from us. So thank you all, and good evening, and the rest of you all who are going to the dinner, we'll be convening because the cars are waiting for us now. Okay, thank you.